The mighty Roman Empire fell in the West long ago, but its cities lived on. From the misty year 500 to 1500, these ancient places found new life under different rulers. Roman streets that once echoed with marching legions now filled with monks' chants and merchants' calls. Temples became churches, forums became marketplaces. City walls built by emperors now protected medieval lords and bishops. These cities tell a story of survival. Some shrank, becoming small towns within massive ancient walls. Others grew beyond their Roman boundaries, building new quarters for guilds and traders. In the east, Constantinople kept Roman glory alive as the heart of Byzantium. In the west, Rome itself became the city of popes instead of emperors. Tonight, we'll walk through time across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. We'll visit places where Roman columns held up medieval roofs. We'll hear the splash of fountains still fed by ancient aqueducts. We'll smell the incense in basilicas built from pagan temples. We'll watch as new peoples, Goths, Arabs, Normans, and many more, made these Roman spaces their own. Some cities thrived through all these years. Others slept beneath the soil until modern times. Each had its own path from ancient glory to medieval life. Each kept some Roman pieces while changing with new needs. Close your eyes now and picture yourself approaching a city at sunset. Stone walls that Romans built still stand tall against the darkening sky. Inside those walls, a new world waits, neither fully Roman nor completely new. A medieval world built on ancient foundations, ready to tell its story. The evening bells of a small church echoed across the ancient forum. Where once the loud voices of Roman officials had proclaimed imperial decrees, now the gentle call to evening prayer filled the air. This scene, playing out in countless cities across the old empire, marked a world in transition. The stone-paved streets first laid by Roman engineers still guided the steps of city dwellers, but those walking them lived in a changed world. As the Western Roman Empire weakened in the 5th century, its cities began a quiet transformation. Most had started as carefully planned Roman settlements. Wide, straight streets crossed at right angles, dividing the city into neat blocks. At the centre stood the forum, an open plaza lined with temples, government buildings, and colonnaded porticos. Public baths offered places for citizens to gather, bathe, and socialise. Amphitheatres and theatres provided entertainment, while aqueducts brought fresh water from distant hills. These cities had been built to a pattern. From Britannia to North Africa, from Hispania to the eastern provinces, Roman towns followed similar designs. A visitor from one end of the empire could easily find their way around a city at the other end. This unity of design reflected the unity of imperial rule. But as the 5th century progressed, this familiar pattern began to change. Imperial officials who once governed these cities gradually disappeared. Tax collectors, magistrates, and governors, the backbone of Roman administration, returned to Rome or simply abandoned their posts. The empire could no longer maintain its reach. Local communities had to adapt. Into this void stepped new leaders, the bishops. Christian churches had been growing in cities for generations. By the 5th century, many urban centres had well-established Christian communities led by bishops. These men, once spiritual leaders only, began taking on civic duties. They organised food supplies during shortages. They negotiated with barbarian leaders. They maintained basic services when imperial officials disappeared. In Rome itself, after Emperor Constantine moved the imperial capital to Constantinople in 324, the popes gradually assumed many functions of civil government. When Rome was threatened by invaders like Attila the Hun in 452, it was Pope Leo X who led the delegation that convinced him to turn away from the city. Ordinary Romans increasingly looked to the church, not distant emperors, for protection and leadership. The physical landscape of cities reflected these changes. The once busy forum in many towns grew quiet as its administrative functions faded. What had been the beating heart of Roman civic life became an open space used for local markets or simply abandoned. In many cities, stones from crumbling forum buildings were carried away to build churches or strengthen city walls. The great Roman temples, once centres of imperial cult worship, found new purpose. Some were converted directly into churches, their strong walls and columns serving a new faith. In Rome, the Pantheon, that marvel of Roman engineering with its perfect dome, became the Church of St. Mary of the Martyrs. Its pagan statues were removed, but its magnificent structure remained. Other temples were dismantled, their marble columns and decorative stones repurposed for church construction. Roman baths, those centres of social life and hygiene, faced varied fates. Some continued operating, though at reduced scale. Others fell into disuse as the complex water systems they required broke down without imperial maintenance. Many were converted to new purposes, workshops, storage spaces, or even churches. The Great Baths of Diocletian in Rome later became the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, its massive vaulted spaces finding new life as sacred halls. City walls took on renewed importance during these uncertain times. Many had been merely symbolic during the peaceful days of imperial rule. Now they were strengthened and raised higher. The pattern of city life contracted, with populations clustering within the safety of walls rather than spreading into suburbs. Streets that had been wide and straight began to narrow as residents built structures against the walls of old buildings or extended their homes into what had been public space. Water systems revealed the changing nature of urban management. The magnificent Roman aqueducts had brought fresh water from miles away, feeding public fountains, baths, and wealthy homes. These engineering marvels required constant maintenance. As imperial systems broke down, many cities could no longer maintain the full network. Local leaders, often bishops, organized efforts to preserve at least some water flow to key fountains and buildings. In Rome, popes took responsibility for repairing broken aqueducts when they could. The homes of ordinary people also changed with the times. The large urban villas of wealthy Romans were often subdivided. Where once a single family had lived in spacious comfort, now multiple families might occupy the same building. Interior gardens were built over to create more living space. Some grand homes became small communities unto themselves. The sounds and smells of city life shifted too. The regular calls of the crier announcing imperial news fell silent. The clatter of carts on stone roads grew less frequent as long-distance trade diminished. The smell of incense from temples gave way to the scent of candles and incense from churches. The regular rhythm of imperial festivals was replaced by the cycle of Christian holy days. Daily routines adapted to these new realities. Without imperial games and festivals, the church calendar provided the framework for public life. Saints' days and religious observances marked the passage of time. The Christian Sunday, rather than the Roman market days, became the pause in the working week. Dawn prayers and evening vespers gave structure to the day. The declining imperial economy changed how people worked and shopped. Large-scale manufacturing of pottery, glass and metals diminished. Local craftsmen produced more goods on a smaller scale. Long-distance trade in luxury items decreased, though never disappeared entirely. Daily markets became more important than the grand commercial structures of imperial times. The meals people ate reflected these economic shifts. Wealthy tables no longer featured exotic foods from across the empire. Local produce and simple cooking replaced elaborate Roman cuisine with its imported spices and ingredients. Wine remained important, though often produced more locally than before. Not all cities experienced these changes equally. Some maintained stronger connections to Roman traditions and structures than others. Ravenna in northern Italy stands as the most striking example. Protected by surrounding marshlands and serving as the western capital of the empire in its final years, Ravenna preserved much of its Roman character. When the Western Empire fell in 476, the city passed first to Odoacer and then to the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled from 493 to 526. Theodoric, though considered a barbarian by Romans, deeply admired Roman culture. In Ravenna, he maintained Roman administrative systems and embarked on an ambitious building program. His palace copied imperial styles. He restored public buildings and kept the aqueducts functioning. Under his rule, Ravenna remained a city of distinctly Roman appearance, even as imperial rule had ended elsewhere. The glittering mosaics of Ravenna's churches, created during Theodoric's reign and the subsequent Byzantine period, show this blend of Roman artistic traditions with Christian themes. In the church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, visitors can still see these magnificent works, their tiny glass tiles catching the light just as they did when newly installed 15 centuries ago. In North Africa, the city of Carthage maintained strong Roman connections as well. Protected by sea and the strength of the Vandal kingdom that took control there, Carthage preserved many Roman buildings and traditions. Its theatre and circus continued hosting events. Its harbour remained busy with Mediterranean trade. The Vandal rulers adopted many aspects of Roman urban life, seeing themselves as inheritors rather than destroyers of Roman ways. Even in cities that changed more dramatically, Roman influences persisted in subtle ways. The layout of streets, though increasingly irregular as new buildings appeared, still followed the original Roman grid pattern underneath. Fragments of Latin remained in daily speech, evolving gradually into early forms of Romance languages. People still gathered at the old forum, now perhaps a market rather than an administrative centre. Water continued to flow through repaired sections of Roman aqueducts or in simplified channels that followed the old routes. Builders still used techniques first developed by Roman engineers, though often at a smaller scale and with less refinement. The rhythms of the agricultural year, established during Roman times, continued to guide planting and harvesting in the surrounding countryside. As darkness fell across these transformed cities, oil lamps and candles created pools of light where once the streets had been brightly lit with public oil lamps maintained by imperial officials. Families gathered in homes that might have been subdivided from large Roman houses. They ate simpler meals at wooden tables rather than reclining in the Roman style. Their prayers, now Christian rather than to Roman gods, still rose from cities whose foundations had been laid by Roman surveyors centuries before. The great monuments of imperial Rome, theatres, temples, baths and forums, now stood in various states of use or abandonment. Some remained active, though serving new purposes. Others were slowly being dismantled, their stones and columns finding new life in churches and fortifications. Still others stood empty, gradually succumbing to the elements as nature began the slow process of reclaiming them. In these changing urban landscapes, people adapted to new realities while carrying forward elements of Roman tradition. Their cities were becoming medieval, yet remained fundamentally shaped by their Roman origins. This transformation, neither sudden nor complete, represented not so much a fall as a metamorphosis of urban life. As twilight deepened over the Seven Hills, Rome stood caught between its past and future. The city that had ruled an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt now faced a new reality. The emperors had gone east to Constantinople. The Senate had lost its power. The grand marble palaces stood quiet. Yet Rome lived on, changing day by day into something new. Rome's story differed from other Roman cities. As the ancient capital, it carried more weight of history. Its transformation held greater meaning. Imagine walking through Rome in the year 410. You would see a city still impressive with its ancient monuments. The Colosseum stood tall. The Forum still displayed its triumphal arches. The Pantheon's perfect dome rose against the sky. Yet something profound had changed. The busy offices of imperial administration had emptied. The once crowded palace on the Palatine Hill stood mostly abandoned. That year brought a shock that marked the changing times. For the first time in 800 years, foreign invaders captured Rome. The Visigoth king Alaric led his warriors through the city gates. Though the Goths only stayed for 3 days, they carried away many treasures. More importantly, they shattered the myth of Rome's invincibility. If Rome could fall, nothing in the world seemed certain anymore. After the Goths left, the city had to rebuild. But who would lead this effort? The emperor lived far away in Constantinople. The old Roman Senate still existed, but had little real power. Into this void stepped a figure whose role would grow more important with each passing decade. The Bishop of Rome, who would later be called the Pope. When Emperor Constantine had made Christianity legal in 313, the Bishop of Rome was just one religious leader among many. By the 5th century, his importance had grown. Bishops like Leo XI, who ruled from 440 to 461, began taking on duties once handled by Roman officials. When food grew scarce, the church organised grain shipments. When buildings needed repair, church funds paid for workers. When Attila the Hun threatened Rome in 452, it was Pope Leo who led the delegation that convinced him to turn away. The papal residence at the Lateran Palace became a centre of administration. Clerks there kept records, managed properties, and carried out the daily business of running the city. They collected rents from church lands, organised food distribution, and settled disputes among citizens. Without making any formal declaration, the bishops of Rome had become the city's caretakers and rulers. As Rome shifted from imperial to papal governance, its physical landscape changed too. Many grand buildings fell into disrepair. Without imperial funds for maintenance, marble columns began to lean. Roof tiles fell and weren't replaced. Weeds grew between paving stones. The great aqueducts that brought fresh water from the hills gradually broke down. As pipes cracked and channels collapsed, many neighbourhoods had to rely on the muddy Tiber River for water. The Roman Forum, once the beating heart of government, slowly transformed. Temples closed as paganism faded. Administrative buildings emptied of officials. Markets moved elsewhere. Gradually, locals even gave the space a new name, the Campo Vaccino, or Cowfield, as herders began letting their animals graze among the ancient monuments. Yet not all was decay. A new Rome emerged within the shell of the old. The most dramatic change involved the repurposing of ancient buildings. Old Roman temples became Christian churches. The massive Pantheon, built to honour all the Roman gods, became the Church of St. Mary of the Martyrs in 609. The Senate House became the Church of St. Adrian. The Temple of Antoninus and Faustina transformed into the Church of San Lorenzo in Miranda. This reuse made practical sense. Why quarry new stone when magnificent buildings already stood ready? Why waste columns and marble panels when they could adorn houses of the new faith? Sometimes the changes were subtle, a Christian altar placed in a former temple, Christian images painted over older decorations. In other cases, buildings were thoroughly transformed. Citizens salvaged building materials from crumbling structures to create new ones. Workers carried columns from abandoned temples to decorate new churches. Marble slabs were cut up and reused as flooring or wall panels. Some beautiful pieces were burned to make lime for mortar. Romans called this practice spoliation, the reuse of older materials in new buildings. Even the massive Colosseum, the great amphitheatre where gladiators had once fought, gradually became a stone quarry. Its perfectly cut blocks found new life in churches and palaces across Rome. Though still largely intact, many of its outer stones were carried away over the centuries. A new sacred geography emerged across Rome. While the old city had focused on the Forum and Capitol Hill, Christian Rome centered on sites connected to saints and martyrs. The graves of Peter and Paul became especially important. Over Peter's tomb on Vatican Hill, Constantine had built the first St. Peter's Basilica. This massive church stood far from the traditional city centre, yet pilgrims flocked there to pray near the apostles' remains. Across Rome, dozens of tituli, early house churches, expanded into proper basilicas. Each neighbourhood had its own patron saint and local shrine. The martyrs' stories became the new foundation myths of Christian Rome. Parents named children after saints rather than ancient heroes. Feast days and religious processions marked the yearly calendar instead of imperial celebrations. The Lateran complex on the eastern edge of the city became the Pope's official residence and cathedral. As Bishop of Rome, each pope was officially based at St. John Lateran, not St. Peter's. The Lateran Palace housed church administration and important councils. Next to it stood the Lateran Baptistery, where new Christians joined the faith. Rome's population changed dramatically during these centuries too. From nearly 1 million residents at its height, the city shrank to perhaps 30,000 people by the year 600. Many wealthy families had followed the emperor to Constantinople. Others fled repeated invasions and economic troubles. Without the massive grain shipments that had once fed the imperial capital, Rome could no longer sustain its former numbers. The smaller population clustered in certain areas, leaving large sections of the ancient city almost empty. The Campus Martius, the flat area near the Tiber River, became the main residential district. People abandoned the hills where water was harder to get after the aqueducts failed. In the former imperial forum, small wooden houses and workshops appeared between crumbling marble monuments. Daily life adapted to these new circumstances. Markets still operated, though on a smaller scale. Crafts continued: pottery, metalworking, leather tanning. But the grand industries that had supplied an empire disappeared. Fine goods now came from Constantinople rather than being made locally. Trade shrank to focus more on necessities. The social makeup of the city changed too. The old Roman aristocracy based on wealth and political office gave way to new elites. Leading families now built their power through connections to the church or military strength. The clergy formed a new social class with significant influence. Monks and nuns appeared in growing numbers, living in communities devoted to prayer and service. Outside, forces continued to shape Rome's development. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Roman rule, tried to maintain control over the city. Emperor Justinian's armies reconquered Rome from Gothic rulers in 536, but the fighting damaged the city further. The Byzantines established an administration under an official called the Exarch, but real power increasingly rested with the Pope. The Lombards, a Germanic people who had settled in northern Italy, repeatedly threatened Rome during the late 6th and 7th centuries. The Byzantine Empire, focused on threats closer to Constantinople, could offer little help. Pope Gregory thus, from 590-604, personally negotiated with Lombard leaders to protect the city. He also organised Rome's defences and food supplies during times of crisis. Gregory represented the new type of papal leader, not just a religious figure but a practical ruler. He managed the vast lands owned by the Roman Church across Italy, Sicily and beyond. He directed church officials like a government. He corresponded with kings and emperors as an equal. Under his guidance, the papacy began developing into a true political power. By the early 8th century, Rome had completed much of its transformation. When pilgrims from Britain or Gaul visited the city, they came to see Christian sites, not just ancient monuments. They sought blessings from the Pope rather than audience with an emperor. They brought prayers to saints' shrines instead of offerings to temples. The old Rome had not disappeared entirely. Its walls still protected the city. Its roads still connected neighborhoods. Its aqueducts, though damaged, still brought some water. Its architectural legacy still inspired awe. But a new Rome had emerged within and upon the ancient frame, a Rome where crosses topped the hills once crowned with temples, where the Pope's word carried more weight than the distant emperor's, and where the glory of heaven mattered more than the glories of empire. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, two very different urban futures emerged from the same Roman roots. In the east, cities kept much of their Roman character. In the west, they changed into something new. This split in urban fortunes shaped how people lived for centuries to come. Think of a traveller in the year 550, journeying first to Constantinople and then to Rome. In Constantinople, this visitor would find a thriving imperial capital of perhaps 500,000 people. Magnificent walls protected the city on three sides. Inside, grand avenues lined with statues led to the vast hippodrome, where crowds cheered chariot races. The great dome of Hagia Sophia, newly built by Emperor Justinian, soared over the skyline. Markets bustled with goods from as far as China and Ethiopia. Imperial officials in silk robes hurried between government buildings, while the emperor himself lived in a vast palace complex by the sea. The same traveller arriving in Rome would find a very different scene. The ancient capital had shrunk to perhaps 50,000 people, living mostly near the Tiber River and inside the Campus Martius. Many hills of Rome stood nearly empty. Ancient monuments served as quarries where workers pried loose stones for new churches. Goats grazed in the old forum. Aqueducts, broken during recent wars, no longer carried water to most neighbourhoods. Power rested not with imperial officials but with the Pope and his clergy. The grand imperial palace on the Palatine Hill stood mostly abandoned. This contrast reveals how differently cities evolved in east and west after the Western Empire fell in 476. In the east, urban life continued with remarkable stability under Byzantine rule. In the west, cities faced waves of disruption that transformed them into smaller, very different places. Constantinople stood as the greatest success story of Eastern urban continuity. Founded by Constantine in 330 on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, it was designed from the start as a new Rome. The city followed Roman patterns with forums, colonnaded streets, baths, theatres, and an imperial palace. When Rome fell to Germanic kings, Constantinople carried on Roman traditions. Emperors ruled from there without interruption, maintaining the machinery of Roman government. The city grew ever more magnificent during Justinian's reign, 527–565. After rioters burned much of the central city in the Nika revolt of 532, the emperor rebuilt on a grander scale. Hagia Sophia rose with its massive dome spanning 100 feet across. The great palace expanded along the shore. New cisterns stored water, new granaries held food, and stronger walls guarded the landward approaches. Daily life in Constantinople followed ancient patterns but with Christian adaptations. The rhythm of days followed church bells rather than the calls of Roman criers. Markets still filled the main streets, but now closed on Sundays. Chariot races still drew passionate crowds to the hippodrome, but began with prayers and hymns. Classical education continued in schools, though now Christian teachings joined the study of ancient writers. Other eastern cities followed similar paths. Antioch in Syria, Ephesus in Asia Minor, Alexandria in Egypt, and Thessalonica in Greece all maintained their ancient street plans, walls, and public buildings. They remained centres of trade, manufacturing, and regional administration. Many kept functioning theatres, baths, and forums. Their populations declined somewhat from peak Roman numbers but remained substantial. Thessalonica, for instance, still housed around 100,000 people in the 6th century. Eastern urban governance preserved much from Roman times. Imperial officials appointed from Constantinople oversaw major cities. Tax systems, legal codes, and administrative practices continued Roman models. Cities still had councils of leading citizens, though with less power than in earlier times. Bishops gained important roles but worked alongside imperial governors rather than replacing them. In the West, cities followed a very different path. Without imperial protection and funding, they faced repeated crises. Many shrank dramatically in size and complexity. Rome itself declined from perhaps 1 million people at its height to fewer than 50,000 by 600. Walls built for much larger populations now enclosed partly abandoned areas. Forums emptied of official business. Aqueducts, damaged by war or neglect, carried less water or stopped working entirely. Even basic street maintenance became difficult. In many Western cities, street levels gradually rose as debris accumulated. Buildings collapsed and were not cleared away. New structures rose on the rubble of old ones. In Rome, the ancient ground level now lies 15 feet or more below modern streets in many areas. Western cities adapted to these new conditions in creative ways. Some buildings found new uses. The great amphitheatre in Arles, in southern Gaul, became a fortified community with houses built inside its massive walls. In Trier, along the Rhine, the immense imperial bath complex was converted into a castle. The arena of Nimes sheltered a small village. Ancient theatres served as quarries or fortresses. The physical footprint of Western cities shrank dramatically. In Roman Britain, cities like London and York contracted to a fraction of their former size. Many abandoned their outer neighbourhoods, clustering within a small defended area, often near a cathedral. Some cities in northern Gaul and Germany were completely abandoned. New forms of urban governance emerged to replace imperial systems. Bishops became the most stable authority in many Western cities. They organised basic services, managed church properties, negotiated with new rulers, and sometimes led defence against attacks. The title Defensor Civitatis, Defender of the City, once a Roman official position, often became attached to the local bishop. In Italy, cities took varying paths. Under Ostrogothic rule, 493-553, King Theodoric maintained some Roman urban traditions, repairing public buildings and sponsoring games. After the destructive Byzantine Gothic Wars, 535-554, urban life suffered greatly. When the Lombards arrived in 568, some cities like Milan and Pavia maintained importance as royal centres. Others declined further. In Gaul, Frankish kings established new patterns of rule. They made their capitals at former Roman cities like Paris, Soissons, and Orléans, but governed in new ways. Royal palaces replaced forums as centres of power. Markets moved from open squares to areas near churches or city gates. The ancient grid of streets gradually gave way to a more irregular medieval pattern, as property boundaries shifted. Spain's cities faced their own transformations. Under Visigothic kings, Toledo became a new capital, its hilltop location valued for defence. The arrival of Muslim rulers after 711 brought another urban future, with cities like Córdoba developing distinctive Islamic features, central mosques, winding streets, and bustling markets, SUQs. Roman patterns remained visible beneath these changes, with city walls and some main streets following ancient lines. Despite these diverging paths, connections between East and West never disappeared completely. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean carrying olive oil, grain, and wine. Eastern pottery and luxury goods still reach Western ports. Diplomatic contacts continued between Constantinople and Western courts. Religious connections remained especially important, with pilgrims and church officials travelling between Rome and eastern cities. Ravenna in northern Italy represents the most interesting urban meeting point between East and West. As the Western Roman capital in the 5th century, then Ostrogothic royal city, and finally Byzantine outpost after Justinian's reconquest, it combined elements of both worlds. Its churches display magnificent Byzantine mosaics, yet they stand in a city that increasingly resembled other Western urban centres in size and function. The most fundamental difference between Eastern and Western urban development lay in basic continuity. Eastern cities evolved gradually within stable imperial frameworks. Western cities underwent more radical transformation amid political fragmentation. Eastern cities maintained more of their classical appearance and functions. Western cities developed new forms that would eventually become recognisably medieval. These different urban trajectories shaped how people lived their daily lives. In Constantinople, a person might still attend public baths, watch entertainments in the hippodrome, and deal with imperial officials in a direct chain from the emperor. In Paris or Milan, that same person would live in a smaller community centred on the cathedral, deal with a count or bishop rather than imperial representatives, and find entertainment in church festivals rather than classical spectacles. By the year 700, these diverging paths had created two distinct urban worlds. The East maintained cities that Romans from centuries earlier would still recognise despite Christian additions. The West had developed something new, the foundations of medieval towns with cathedrals as their focus, irregular street patterns and new forms of authority. Both grew from Roman roots, but they had become very different branches of the same urban tree. While the cities of the West shrank and changed, Constantinople stood as the greatest urban triumph of the medieval world. A visitor sailing into its harbour in the year 600 would see a sight that no Western city could match. High walls lined the shore. Behind them, hills covered with palaces, churches and public buildings rose toward the sky. Domes gleamed in the sun. Statues looked down from columns and squares. Markets bustled with traders from 3 continents. This was no fading reminder of past glory. This was a living, growing imperial capital. Constantinople began as the Greek colony of Byzantium over 1,000 years before it became an imperial capital. The city sat on a triangular peninsula where Europe and Asia nearly touch across the narrow Bosporus Strait. This location controlled the water passage between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. It also stood at the meeting point of major land routes connecting Europe and Asia. Few places on Earth enjoyed such a perfect position for trade and defence. When Emperor Constantine chose this spot for his new capital in 324, he planned a city worthy of the Roman Empire's grandeur. Workers expanded the old Greek town into a much larger city. They built new walls, a hippodrome for chariot races, palaces, a senate house, public squares, and Christian churches. The city was dedicated in 330 as New Rome, though people soon called it Constantinople, Constantine's city. The basic shape of Constantinople was triangular, with water on two sides, the Golden Horn Inlet to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and land walls to the west. Inside this space, the city followed the standard Roman plan with some adjustments for the hilly terrain. Two main streets crossed the city. The Mese, or Middle Way, ran from the main western gate toward the city centre. Lined with colonnaded walkways to shelter people from sun and rain, it passed through a series of public squares before reaching the heart of the city. At this central area stood the greatest urban spaces in the medieval world. The Augusteum Square connected the Great Palace Complex, the Senate House, and the enormous public baths of Zeuxippus. Nearby rose the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, first built by Constantine's son Constantius, rebuilt by Justinian after fire destroyed the earlier church during the Nika riots of 532. Justinian's Hagia Sophia stood as the greatest architectural wonder of the medieval world. Its massive dome seemed to float above the ground, supported by hidden pendentives, curved triangular sections that allowed the round dome to rest on a square base. When visitors entered the church, many fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sense of divine presence created by the vast open space, golden mosaics, and light flooding through dozens of windows around the base of the dome. Next to Hagia Sophia stood the Hippodrome, a massive stadium for chariot racing and public ceremonies. Built to hold up to 100,000 spectators, it followed the pattern of the Circus Maximus in Rome but developed its own traditions. The racing teams, the blues, greens, reds and whites, became important social organizations in the city. People identified strongly with their favorite team, which also represented their neighborhood and political views. The emperor watched races from the Kathisma, a special imperial box connected directly to the Great Palace. The Great Palace itself was not a single building, but a vast complex covering the southeastern corner of the city. Multiple buildings, courtyards, gardens, and churches spread across this area, connected by corridors and passages. The Daphne Palace, Magnora Palace, and Bacolion Palace were among the many imperial residences and ceremonial spaces where the emperor lived and ruled. As the city grew, emperors added new defences. The greatest of these were the Theodosian walls built in the 5th century. This massive defensive system included a moat, an outer wall, and a much taller inner wall with towers spaced closely together. For nearly 1,000 years, these walls kept Constantinople safe from attack by land. No invader managed to break through them until the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and even then the attackers entered through a sea gate, not the land walls. Inside these strong defences, imperial institutions maintained the traditions of Roman governance with remarkable continuity. While Western Roman administration collapsed under barbarian pressure, Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, government continued to function effectively. The emperor stood at the top of this system, seen as God's representative on earth. Unlike Western kings who travelled between different residences, the Byzantine emperor typically remained in Constantinople, governing from the Great Palace. The imperial court developed elaborate ceremonies that highlighted the emperor's sacred role. When foreign visitors approached the imperial throne, they found the emperor seated on a platform that could be mechanically raised during the audience. Golden lions beside the throne might suddenly roar, and golden birds on a golden tree might begin to sing, all through hidden mechanisms designed to impress visitors with seemingly magical displays of power. A complex bureaucracy served the emperor, staffed by educated officials who had studied rhetoric, law, and administration. The position of imperial secretary, or keeper of the inkstand, was highly prestigious. Controlling access to the emperor and drafting imperial decrees, the Master of Offices oversaw the civil service and foreign affairs. The Quaestor served as chief legal officer. The Count of the Sacred Largus managed imperial finances. These and many other officials maintained detailed records, collected taxes, and implemented the emperor's decisions throughout the empire. Unlike the West, where literacy declined sharply after Rome's fall, Constantinople maintained schools that taught reading, writing, rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The Imperial University, founded in 425 and reorganized by Emperor Theodosius II, provided higher education for future officials. While most students were sons of the elite, some children of humble background might receive education through church schools or imperial patronage if they showed exceptional promise. The law remained a particularly important aspect of Byzantine governance. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian ordered a massive compilation and organization of Roman legal texts. The resulting Corpus Juris Civilis, body of civil law, preserved Roman legal principles that would later influence legal systems across Europe. Byzantine courts continued to apply these laws with modifications appropriate to changing times and Christian values. Constantinople's economic life thrived on its position at the crossroads of international trade. The city's harbour on the Golden Horn buzzed with activity as ships arrived from across the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Merchants from Venice and Genoa established trading quarters in the city. Arab traders brought goods from the east. Russian merchants sailed down the Dnieper River to sell furs, honey and slaves. Goods from as far as China and Scandinavia passed through Constantinople's markets. The city controlled critical trade routes and maintained a powerful navy to protect them. A heavy iron chain could be raised across the Golden Horn to block enemy ships during times of danger. The Byzantine gold coin, the solidus, later called the numisma, maintained its weight and purity for centuries, making it the most trusted currency in the medieval world. Merchants everywhere accepted these coins, which featured the emperor's image and Christian symbols. Government workshops called the imperial factories produced luxury goods under strict quality control. Purple silk became especially associated with imperial power. Only the emperor and his closest family could wear garments of true purple. The process for making this special dye remained a closely guarded secret. Other workshops created fine jewellery, ivory carvings, and metalwork that reached distant markets and influenced artistic styles across Europe and Asia. Daily life in Constantinople differed greatly from conditions in Western cities of the same period. The city maintained functioning aqueducts that brought fresh water from sources over 100 kilometres away. Public fountains provided water to ordinary people, while wealthy homes had their own water pipes. Large cisterns stored water against times of siege or drought. The largest of these, the Basilica cistern built by Justinian, could hold 80,000 cubic metres of water in a forest of over 300 marble columns. Public bathhouses continued the Roman tradition of communal bathing, though with some changes reflecting Christian modesty. Men and women bathed separately, and the baths became places for socializing rather than the multi-purpose leisure complexes of earlier Roman times. Still, for ordinary people, these baths provided a level of cleanliness unavailable in Western cities, where such facilities had largely disappeared. The Byzantine diet centered on bread, olive oil, wine, vegetables, and fish. Meat appeared less frequently on common tables, though it featured prominently at elite feasts. The city's food supply came from nearby farms, fishing fleets in the Bosporus and Marmara, and grain shipped from Egypt and later from Thrace. The government maintained emergency food supplies against times of shortage or siege. Houses in Constantinople ranged from simple wooden structures for the poor to elaborate stone mansions for the wealthy. Many people lived in multi-storey buildings divided into apartments, a housing type rare in the medieval West but common in this densely populated city. Streets were narrow and winding in residential areas, but major avenues remained broad and straight, following the original Roman plan. Religious life centered on the many churches throughout the city. Besides the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, hundreds of smaller churches served local neighborhoods. The rhythm of daily bells calling people to prayer and the cycle of religious festivals throughout the year gave structure to urban life. Processions on major feast days saw icons and relics carried through the streets, while crowds watched and participated. Cultural life flourished in this sophisticated urban environment. Constantinople maintained libraries holding thousands of manuscripts when Western collections might contain only dozens. Scholars preserved and studied works of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, science, and medicine. Schools taught classical Greek alongside Christian texts, maintaining continuity with the ancient past while adapting it to Christian purposes. Art in Constantinople developed distinctive styles and techniques that influenced the entire medieval world. Mosaics made with tiny glass cubes covered the walls and domes of churches, glowing with gold backgrounds and depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, and emperors in formal spiritualized poses. Icon painting became a highly developed art form, creating portable religious images that served as windows to the divine. Ivory carving, manuscript illumination, metalwork, and textile design all reached high levels of refinement. Music played an important role in both religious and secular life. Church choirs performed complex chants for the liturgy, developing the 8-tone system that would influence both Western and Eastern Christian music. At court and in wealthy homes, musicians performed on instruments like the organ, lyre, and various wind instruments. Popular songs and dances enlivened festivals and celebrations among ordinary people. As the medieval period progressed, Constantinople faced growing challenges. Arab conquests in the 7th century deprived the empire of wealthy provinces like Egypt and Syria. New peoples like the Bulgars, Slavs, and later the Turks pressed against the empire's borders. Yet the city remained a bastion of urban civilization when cities elsewhere had shrunk to a fraction of their Roman size. Even after the disastrous Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western crusaders captured and looted the city, Constantinople recovered. Though diminished, it continued as an imperial capital until finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. By that time, the city had maintained urban traditions and imperial governance for more than 1,000 years after Rome itself had lost its imperial role, a remarkable testament to the endurance of Roman urban civilization in its eastern form. While Constantinople stood as the gleaming capital of the Byzantine world, hundreds of other cities across the empire kept Roman urban traditions alive. These provincial centres, some dating back to ancient Greek times, maintained many features of Roman civic life, even as they developed their own distinct medieval character. They served as regional capitals, military strongholds, trading hubs, and centres of Christian worship. Their streets, walls, and buildings told stories of both Roman continuity and Byzantine adaptation. Among these provincial cities, Thessalonica in northern Greece ranked second only to Constantinople in size and importance. Founded in 315 BCE and named for the sister of Alexander the Great, this port city had thrived as a major Roman centre for centuries. Its position on the Via Egnatia, the great Roman road connecting the Adriatic to Constantinople, ensured its lasting significance. Massive walls built under Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century still protected the city during Byzantine times, with later emperors strengthening and extending them. At its heart stood a large forum following the Roman plan, where merchants displayed goods from across the Mediterranean world. Grain from Egypt, spices from the east, furs from the north, and local products all changed hands here. The clatter of cartwheels on stone-paved streets, the calls of merchants, and the sense of exotic goods filled this busy space through the Middle Byzantine period. Nearby rose the Rotunda, a massive circular building first built by Emperor Galerius around 300 CE. Originally intended as an imperial mausoleum, it later became the Church of St. George. Inside, magnificent gold mosaics covered the dome, depicting angels and saints against a starry background. Worshippers standing below gazed up at these glittering figures seeming to float in heavenly light. Thessalonica maintained its prosperity through trade, but also faced repeated threats. Slavic tribes, Bulgars, Arabs, and later Normans all attempted to capture this wealthy prize. The city's Roman walls, regularly maintained and strengthened by Byzantine governors, proved their worth time and again. Local residents took pride in their defences, attributing many miraculous deliverances to their patron saint Demetrius, whose basilica remained the city's spiritual centre. Inside this enormous church, silver lamps burned day and night before the saint's shrine. Pilgrims came from across the empire seeking healing from the fragrant myrrh that reportedly flowed from his tomb. The walls of the church displayed mosaic scenes of the saint's life and miracles, including his divine protection of the city during sieges. These images reinforced civic identity and pride among Thessalonians, who saw themselves as divinely protected citizens of a special place. Further east, across the Aegean Sea, the cities of Asia Minor preserved Roman urban patterns while adapting to changing times. Ephesus, once the grandest Roman city in the region, remained an important centre into the early Byzantine period. Its broad marble-paved streets, colonnaded ways, and grand public buildings spoke of Roman planning. The harbour street, running straight from the long-silted harbour to the Great Theatre, maintained its ancient course through Byzantine times. At the end of this grand avenue rose the Library of Celsus. Though no longer holding scrolls as in Roman days, its impressive facade with niches for statues and rows of columns continued to impress visitors. Nearby, the great theatre that once held 25,000 spectators stood silent. Theatrical performances had ended as Christian values changed entertainment preferences. Instead, the space occasionally served for public gatherings and announcements by imperial officials. As centuries passed, Ephesus gradually contracted. The harbour that had brought wealth silted up despite repeated dredging efforts. Residents abandoned outer neighbourhoods, clustering closer to the centre. The enormous Church of St. John, built on a hill overlooking the city, became the new focus of urban life. Pilgrims came to pray at the Apostles' Tomb, bringing business to local inns, food sellers, and shops producing religious souvenirs. Unlike Western cities that often shrank dramatically, Ephesus and other Byzantine provincial centres typically maintained substantial populations. Imperial administrators ensured that aqueducts continued functioning, bringing fresh water to public fountains throughout the city. Engineers trained in the old Roman techniques regularly inspected and repaired these vital systems. In the northwestern corner of Asia Minor, the city of Nicaea played a special role in Byzantine history. Founded by a successor of Alexander the Great and later a prosperous Roman provincial centre, Nicaea gained lasting fame as the site of Christianity's first ecumenical council in 325 CE. The Roman Emperor Constantine had gathered bishops there to resolve doctrinal disputes, establishing a precedent for imperial involvement in church affairs that would continue throughout Byzantine history. Nicaea's most impressive feature was its Roman walls, among the best-preserved defensive systems in the empire. A double line of massive stone barriers studded with towers enclosed the city in a perfect square, following the original Roman street grid. 4 main gates opened to the cardinal directions, each flanked by towers. For travellers approaching across the plain, these walls presented an imposing sight, a perfect Roman defensive system maintained through Byzantine centuries. Inside these formidable walls, Nicaea's streets still followed their ancient grid pattern, meeting at right angles. The central area featured a Roman-style forum and administrative buildings. Here the urban praetor appointed by Constantinople held court and managed city affairs. Nearby stood the cathedral where the famous council had met, now rebuilt into a larger Byzantine church with gleaming mosaics and marble columns. Lake Ascania lapped against the western wall, providing both defensive protection and food for the citizens. Fishermen brought daily catches to the market, while farmers from surrounding lands supplied fruits, vegetables, and grain. Despite its inland location, trade flourished along the ancient Roman roads that connected Nicaea to Constantinople and other cities. Far to the northeast, on the distant shores of the Black Sea, Trebizond stood as the empire's outpost on the edge of the Byzantine world. Founded by Greek colonists centuries before Rome existed, this city had been incorporated into the Roman Empire and continued as a vital Byzantine centre. Its dramatic setting, perched between mountains and sea, made it naturally defensible and strikingly beautiful. The city occupied a narrow shelf of land with steep cliffs rising behind it, and the Black Sea stretching before it. Ships from across the sea brought goods from the distant Crimea, the Caucasus, and even from ports connected to the Silk Road. Merchants from many lands filled its marketplaces, speaking diverse languages and trading exotic goods. Trebizond's main street, like those of many Byzantine provincial cities, followed the path of an ancient Roman road. Flanked by covered porticos protecting pedestrians from rain and sun, this thoroughfare connected the main gates and provided space for shops and markets. Churches dotted the cityscape, their domes and crosses visible from the harbour as ships approached. The grandest of these, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, its frescoes depicting Christ, the Virgin, and scenes from Scripture. The governor's palace, built on the highest point within the walls, combined administrative offices with luxurious living quarters. From here, imperial officials collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained correspondence with Constantinople. When the capital seemed distant or distracted by other concerns, these governors often exercised considerable independence in decision-making. Throughout the Byzantine provinces, cities maintained many institutions inherited from Roman times. The basic unit of urban administration remained the city council, though its composition and powers had evolved. No longer dominated by wealthy landowners as in Roman days, these councils now included bishops, military officials, and merchants alongside the traditional aristocracy. They supervised markets, maintained public buildings, organised festivals, and allocated funds for repairs to walls and water systems. Water management showed remarkable continuity with Roman practices. The aqueducts, cisterns, and public fountains that had made Roman cities famous for their hygiene remained vital parts of Byzantine urban infrastructure. In Ankara, the Roman aqueduct continued bringing water to the city centre, where it filled public fountains where women gathered daily with clay jugs, exchanging news while collecting household water. In Thessalonica, enormous Roman cisterns beneath the city stored water against times of drought or siege. In Ephesus, public latrines from Roman times remained in use, connected to sophisticated drainage systems that kept the city relatively clean and healthy. Streets in these provincial cities typically preserved their Roman paving, though with accumulated repairs over centuries. Major avenues remained broad and straight, often lined with colonnades providing covered walkways. In narrower side streets, upper stories of buildings sometimes extended outward, nearly touching across the street. These projections created shady spaces below where neighbours could chat during hot afternoons. The rhythm of daily life in these provincial cities followed patterns both ancient and new. The day began with church bells calling people to morning prayers. Markets opened as the sun rose, filling with noise and activity. By midday, many workshops closed temporarily as people sought shelter from the heat. Evening brought another round of business before church bells again called the faithful to vespers. This Christian schedule overlaid the older Roman pattern of urban life, creating a distinctly Byzantine daily rhythm. Public spaces served different functions than in Roman times. The theatres and amphitheatres that had been centres of Roman entertainment stood empty or repurposed. Hippodrome racing continued in some larger provincial cities, but on a smaller scale than Constantinople's grand spectacles. Instead, church courtyards and the spaces before government buildings became gathering places for announcements, celebrations, and community events. The Forum or Agora remained the commercial heart of most cities, though now often overshadowed by the cathedral square in religious and civic importance. On market days, farmers from surrounding villages brought produce on donkeys or in ox carts, setting up temporary stalls. Craftspeople displayed their goods, pottery, textiles, leather items, and metalworks. Money changers sat at small tables, weighing coins and calculating exchange rates between Byzantine gold solidi and various foreign currencies. Provincial cities differed from Western medieval towns in maintaining stronger connections to central authority. The emperor appointed key officials, the praetor or urban governor, the military commander, tax collectors, and judges. Imperial laws applied throughout the realm, providing consistency in governance. When Justinian issued his famous law code in the 6th century, copies were sent to every provincial city, where local judges were expected to follow its provisions. Yet distance from Constantinople allowed considerable local adaptation. Cities with strong commercial traditions like Thessalonica or Trebizond developed regulations favourable to merchant guilds. Those with important religious shrines like Ephesus with St. John's tomb created systems for managing pilgrim traffic. Military outposts emphasised defence and supply systems for troops. For ordinary people living in these provincial centres, the city provided both protection and opportunity. Within strong walls maintained according to ancient Roman engineering principles, residents found shelter from outside threats. The continuation of Roman municipal services, water supplies, street cleaning, market regulation, created relatively comfortable living conditions by medieval standards. Churches provided spiritual guidance, charity for the poor, and education for some children. Markets connected even modest households to wider networks of trade and cultural exchange. As darkness fell across these Byzantine provincial cities, oil lamps glowed in windows and streets grew quiet. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns, calling the hours as they passed. From governors' palaces to humble homes, people slept within the shelter of walls first built by Roman engineers, but maintained through centuries of Byzantine care, living examples of how Roman urban traditions continued to shape daily life across the eastern Mediterranean world. As cities across the Byzantine Empire maintained their ancient roots while adapting to Christian times, a new urban world took shape within the old Roman framework. The transformation happened slowly, stone by stone, over centuries. While Constantinople dazzled with imperial splendour, hundreds of provincial cities underwent their own changes. The physical shape of urban life evolved as the empire's needs and beliefs changed, creating spaces where ancient traditions and new Christian practices existed side by side. The Romans had been master builders of public works. Their aqueducts, forums, baths, and paved streets had made city life comfortable even by modern standards. Byzantine cities inherited this valuable infrastructure. Many aqueducts continued carrying fresh water into urban centres for centuries after the Western Empire collapsed. In Constantinople, the massive Valens aqueduct, completed in 368, continued supplying water to the city well into Ottoman times. In smaller cities across the empire, local officials maintained ancient water systems with careful repairs. Stone channels first laid by Roman engineers still guided water to public fountains where women gathered daily with clay jars. The maintenance of these systems wasn't just practical, it represented continuity with the past. Byzantine governors took pride in preserving what earlier builders had created. When earthquakes damaged the aqueduct at Ephesus in the 6th century, repairs were made using the same Roman techniques of fitted stone and waterproof mortar. One inscription from a restored water channel in Asia Minor proudly declares that the governor had renewed the works of the ancients for the benefit of today's citizens. Underground cisterns provided another crucial element of water management. Constantinople's Basilica cistern, built under Justinian, could store over 80,000 cubic meters of water beneath its forest of columns. Provincial cities had their own water storage systems. In Thessalonica, enormous Roman cisterns still collected rainwater, providing reserves during droughts or sieges. Local residents called them the hidden lakes beneath our feet. Roman baths, those centres of ancient social life, faced mixed fates in Byzantine times. Many continued operating, though often on a smaller scale. Christian attitudes toward public nudity and concerns about modesty led to changes in bathing practices. Men and women now bathed separately, and the buildings themselves were modified. The expansive exercise courts and social halls of Roman baths were often subdivided into smaller spaces or repurposed entirely. In Ankara, the great bath complex became a market hall, its hypocaust heating systems abandoned but its massive walls still standing. Not all Roman infrastructure survived so successfully. The entertainment buildings of the ancient world theatres and amphitheatres largely lost their original functions. Christian authorities discouraged the bawdy comedies and violent spectacles that had filled these spaces. Many became quarries for building stone, while others were converted to more practical uses. In Arles and Nîmes in southern Gaul, Roman amphitheatres became fortified communities, with houses built into their arched corridors. In Pergamon, the steep theatre was abandoned entirely, its marble seats gradually carried away for new buildings. Forums, those open plazas at the heart of Roman cities, often remained central to urban life but with new purposes. What had been spaces for civic assemblies and imperial ceremonies became marketplaces and gathering areas near cathedrals. In Ephesus, the commercial agora continued as a trading centre, but the statues of gods and emperors that once lined its edges were replaced by crosses and Christian symbols. In Gerasa, modern Jerash, shops built into the colonnaded streets followed the same pattern as in Roman times, but now merchants sold candles for church offerings alongside everyday goods. As some ancient urban elements declined, new architectural forms transformed the Byzantine cityscape. The most dramatic change was the emergence of the Christian church as the dominant urban building type. Where temples had once honoured pagan gods, churches now rose across the empire. These weren't simply religious buildings, they became the primary public spaces of Byzantine urban life, where communities gathered not just for worship but for social interaction, education, and even shelter during emergencies. The shift from temple to church represented more than a change in religion. It transformed how people used urban space. Ancient temples had been primarily exterior monuments. Worshippers gathered outside, where priests performed sacrifices at outdoor altars. The temple itself was a house for the deity, not a gathering space for people. Churches, in contrast, were designed to welcome congregations inside. Their architecture focused on creating interior spaces where hundreds could gather to participate in the liturgy. Early churches often followed the basilica plan, a rectangular hall with colonnaded aisles and an apse at one end. This form, adapted from Roman civic buildings, provided practical space for congregations. In Constantinople, Justinian's Hagia Sophia introduced a revolutionary new form, the domed basilica. Its vast central dome seemed to float above the worship space, creating an awe-inspiring effect that visitors described as heaven on earth. Provincial churches couldn't match this splendour, but many adopted elements of its style, with smaller domes and semi-domes creating uplifting interior spaces. The sensory experience of these churches contrasted sharply with ancient temples. Where temples had been bright, open structures, churches created darker, more mysterious environments. Small windows filtered sunlight, creating dramatic rays that illuminated gold mosaics and silver lamps. The scent of incense filled these spaces, while the acoustics enhanced the chanting of choirs. One pilgrim described entering a church in Antioch. The darkness first made me uncertain, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw gold gleaming everywhere, caught by thin beams of light. The voices of unseen singers seemed to come from heaven itself. Around these churches, Byzantine cities developed new urban patterns. Streets that had once led to forums and temples now directed traffic toward cathedrals. In many cities, the bishop's residence, episcopeion, grew into an administrative complex rivaling the governor's palace. Church-run institutions, hospitals, orphanages, hospices for travellers created new types of urban buildings. In Ephesus, archaeologists have uncovered a 6th century complex identified as a Znodokaion, Pilgrim Hostel, near the Church of St. John, complete with dormitories, dining halls and bathing facilities. Monasteries emerged as another new urban form, sometimes within city walls but more often just outside them. These walled compounds contained churches, living quarters, workshops, and gardens where monks or nuns lived in religious communities. In Constantinople, the Studios monastery housed hundreds of monks who maintained a continuous cycle of prayer while also copying manuscripts and producing crafts. In provincial cities, monasteries often served as centres of education and charity, providing food for the poor and medical care for the sick. Perhaps the most visible change to Byzantine cities came in their defensive works. As the empire faced growing external threats, urban fortifications took on new importance. Roman cities had often spread beyond their ancient walls during peaceful times, creating suburbs along major roads. Now these outlying areas were frequently abandoned as populations contracted behind strengthened fortifications. The defensive needs of medieval times led to interesting adaptations of ancient plans. Roman cities had typically followed orderly grid patterns with straight streets crossing at right angles. As Byzantine cities rebuilt their walls, they often created more irregular circuits that followed natural contours to improve defensibility. Inside these walls, the neat Roman street grid gradually dissolved as buildings encroached on public spaces. Streets narrowed as shop owners and homeowners extended their properties. What had been broad avenues in Roman times became the twisted, irregular streets typical of medieval cities. In some cities, entirely new fortified circuits appeared within the ancient walls, creating citadels or acropolis where the population could retreat during sieges. Ankara developed such an inner fortress on its highest hill, using stones from ancient temples and public buildings. Similar inner fortresses appeared in cities across the empire, from Thessalonica to Trebizond, their walls often incorporating columns and carved blocks from older structures. The sensory experience of walking through a Byzantine city would have differed greatly from its Roman predecessor. Streets were narrower and less regular, creating an environment of surprise rather than orderly vistas. Upper stories of buildings often projected outward, creating sheltered spaces below but further narrowing the path. The sound of church bells replaced the calls of Roman criers marking the hours. The smell of incense mingled with the more mundane odours of urban life bread baking. Animals, crafts like tanning and dyeing. Markets remained central to daily life but changed in character. The ordered market halls of Roman cities gave way to more specialised commercial districts. Byzantine cities typically had a main commercial street, the Mysae in Constantinople, lined with shops selling luxury goods. Other neighbourhoods specialised in particular trades, the coppersmiths in one area, leather workers in another, bakers somewhere else. Food markets often operated in open spaces near churches, where farmers from surrounding villages brought produce daily. The organisation of residential neighbourhoods reflected both continuity and change. The Roman habit of separating commercial and residential functions weakened over time. Workshops and small businesses increasingly operated on ground floors with living quarters above. Wealthy homes retained interior courtyards following ancient patterns, but these spaces became smaller as land within city walls grew more valuable. Poor families increasingly lived in multi-storey buildings divided into apartments, especially in larger cities. The visual appearance of Byzantine cities combined ancient elements with new Christian symbolism. Crosses appeared everywhere over doorways carved into window frames, mounted atop columns that had once supported pagan statues. Streets that had been named for ancient gods or emperors now honoured saints and martyrs. City gates, once dedicated to victory or imperial glory, now sought protection from patron saints. Perhaps the most significant change in urban life was the rhythm of time itself. Roman cities had followed a calendar of imperial festivals, market days, and pagan celebrations. Byzantine cities moved to the beat of the Christian year. The great feasts of Easter, Christmas, Epiphany, and local saints' days structured urban life. Processions wound through the streets on these holy days, with clergy carrying icons and relics while crowds followed with candles and chanted prayers. By nightfall, Byzantine cities grew quiet in ways their Roman predecessors had not. With fewer public entertainments and stricter moral codes, evening activities centred more on home and family. The streets darkened except for occasional oil lamps marking important buildings or shrines. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns, calling the hours and watching for fires. The great danger in cities built largely of wood and other flammable materials. These Byzantine cities, neither fully Roman nor yet completely medieval, represented a crucial transition in urban history. They preserved elements of classical city planning while adapting to new religious beliefs and defensive needs. Their walls, churches, markets, and neighbourhoods created environments where ancient wisdom and Christian faith coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, as darkness fell across these communities each night. The glow of lamps before household icons and church shrines lit windows from Thessalonica to Trebizond, from Ephesus to Antioch, small flames of continuity in a world of profound change. As night fell across the Byzantine cities of the East, a new dawn was breaking in the old heartland of Rome. Italy, the birthplace of the empire, faced a different path than its eastern counterpart. Here, ancient cities with marble temples and grand forums faced waves of new masters: Ostrogoths, Byzantines, and Lombards. Each brought their own ideas about how cities should look and function. The result was a unique blend of ancient Roman foundations with new medieval adaptations. Among these Italian cities, Ravenna shone brightest during the uncertain years after Rome's fall. Located near the Adriatic coast, protected by surrounding marshlands, this city became the western capital of the Roman Empire during its final years. When the last Western emperor fell in 476, Ravenna didn't collapse into ruin. Instead, it transformed under new leadership, first Odoacer, then the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled from 493 to 526. Theodoric was a remarkable figure, a Germanic king who deeply admired Roman culture. Though considered a barbarian by traditional Romans, he had spent years in Constantinople and understood the power of urban grandeur. In Ravenna, he built a palace modelled on Constantinople's Great Palace, with colourful marble floors and spacious reception halls. Walking through its corridors, visitors would have smelled the sweet incense that filled the air during ceremonies, heard the soft footsteps on marble floors, and seen sunlight streaming through alabaster window screens. Nearby stood Theodoric's mausoleum, a remarkable structure topped with a massive single stone dome over 30 feet wide. Unlike the complex domes of the East built from many small pieces, this dome was carved from a single enormous block of Istrian stone, weighing more than 300 tons. Even today, visitors wonder how 6th century engineers raised such a weight nearly 40 feet into the air. Inside Ravenna's churches, the most stunning features were the glittering mosaics that still dazzle visitors today. In the church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, originally built as Theodoric's palace church, walls shine with golden tesserae depicting Christ, saints, and biblical scenes. San Vitale, completed under Byzantine rule after Emperor Justinian reconquered the city in 540, contains the famous mosaics showing Justinian and his wife Theodora with their courts. These weren't just beautiful decorations, they were political statements showing who held power. The sound of prayers in Ravenna changed with its rulers. Under Theodoric, the Latin of the Arian Christian service echoed through the churches. After Byzantine conquest, Greek chants joined Latin hymns as Eastern clergy arrived. Ordinary citizens heard these changes in the daily rhythm of sacred music flowing from church doors. Daily life in Ravenna maintained many Roman patterns despite political changes. The aqueduct still brought fresh water to public fountains, markets still operated in open squares, but subtle differences appeared. New buildings used more wood and brick than marble. Streets gradually narrowed as shopkeepers built wooden stalls against ancient buildings. North of Ravenna, other Italian cities faced more dramatic changes. In 568, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, crossed the Alps and swept into northern Italy. Unlike Theodoric, with his respect for Roman ways, early Lombard rulers had little interest in maintaining urban traditions. They preferred their traditional rural settlements and wooden halls. Cities like Milan, Pavia, and Verona initially suffered under Lombard rule. Buildings crumbled without repair. Forums emptied of commerce. Water systems failed without maintenance. But over time, something unexpected happened. Lombard kings gradually recognized the advantages of Roman urban life. By the late 7th century, they began repairing walls, restoring public buildings, and settling permanently in cities. Pavia became the favoured Lombard capital. There, King Liutprand built new churches in the early 8th century, blending Germanic preferences for simple structures with Roman techniques. Inside these churches, the sounds of footsteps echoed differently than in ancient Roman buildings. Wooden floors replaced marble, creating a warmer, softer acoustic. Small, narrow windows let in limited light, creating mysterious shadows rather than the bright openness of classical buildings. The sense of these northern cities changed too. As public baths closed without fuel to heat them, the mingled smells of unwashed bodies became more common. The smoke of cooking fires hung heavy in narrow streets where once incense and perfumes had dominated. These weren't the carefully planned cities of antiquity, but adapted spaces where survival took priority over beauty. Street levels rose steadily throughout this period as debris accumulated without systematic clearing. In many northern Italian towns, the ground floor of Roman buildings became the basement level of medieval structures. People literally lived on top of the past. Walking through these cities, one would have climbed worn stone steps leading up to buildings that once had ground-level entrances, or descended into half-buried Roman shops repurposed as storage cellars. In southern Italy and Sicily, different masters brought different changes. Byzantine control remained stronger here, especially after Emperor Justinian's reconquest in the 6th century. Cities like Naples, Amalfi and Palermo maintained closer ties to Constantinople. Their streets still echoed with Greek as well as Latin. Eastern goods, silks, spices and ceramics remained available in markets that continued active trade with the Byzantine East. Syracuse in Sicily, once one of the greatest cities of the ancient Greek world, continued as an important Byzantine centre. Its cathedral incorporated the massive columns of an ancient Greek temple, creating a striking visual reminder of the city's long history. Walking inside, worshippers moved through a space that had been sacred for well over 1,000 years, the smell of incense mixing with the salt breeze from the nearby harbour. Perhaps the most dramatic urban developments came in the emerging maritime cities along Italy's coasts. As inland trade routes became dangerous due to warfare and banditry, coastal settlements gained new importance. Venice, built improbably on muddy islands in a lagoon, began its rise during this period. Founded by refugees fleeing Lombard invasions, it developed as a unique urban space without direct Roman foundations. Early Venice had no forum, no grid plan, no ancient monuments. Instead, it created something entirely new, a city where canals replaced streets and boats replaced carts. The sound of oars slipping through water and the calls of boatmen replaced the rumble of wheels on stone pavements. Buildings rose directly from the water, their wooden piles driven deep into the mud for stability. The scent of salt water permeated everything. Other coastal cities like Amalfi and later Genoa similarly developed new urban patterns based on maritime needs. Harbour facilities took precedence over forums. Defensive works focused on protecting ships and trade goods rather than just city residents. These cities looked outward to the sea rather than inward to the land, beginning a new chapter in Mediterranean urban life. Physical transformation marked all Italian cities during these centuries. The massive stones of Roman monuments became building materials for new structures. In Rome itself, medieval churches incorporated ancient columns in new arrangements. The forum slowly filled with earth, eventually becoming a pasture known as the Campo Vaccino, the cow field, where animals grazed among toppled columns. Streets narrowed as residents built new structures against ancient walls, gradually transforming the regular Roman grid into the winding passages typical of medieval cities. Upper stories of buildings often extended outward over streets, creating dark tunnels where once broad avenues had allowed sunlight to reach the pavement. The sounds of cities changed too. The regular calls of Roman criers marking the hours gave way to church bells ringing for prayers. The Latin spoken in streets evolved gradually into early forms of Italian, with local dialects developing in each region. Greek remained common in southern coastal cities with Byzantine connections. Germanic languages added new words and sounds in Lombard territories. Water management revealed much about changing urban priorities. In some cities, reduced populations could no longer maintain the extensive Roman aqueduct systems. Water supply contracted to a few main fountains near city centres. In others, like Rome itself, broken sections of aqueducts were repaired to serve limited areas, particularly church complexes and monasteries. The gentle splashing of fountain water, once common throughout Roman cities, became concentrated in fewer locations. By the early 8th century, Italian cities had completed much of their transformation from classical to medieval forms. Roman foundations remained visible everywhere, in street layouts, in reused building materials, in the very locations of settlements. But the functions and forms of urban spaces had fundamentally changed. These cities no longer served as administrative centres for a vast empire. Instead, they functioned as regional capitals, as centres of religious authority, as defensive strongholds, or as trading hubs. Their physical forms reflected these new roles. Cathedrals replaced temples, castles replaced forums, harbours expanded while theatres crumbled. Walking through an Italian city at dusk in the year 700, a time traveller from ancient Rome would still recognise the bones of the place. The hills where temples had stood, the courses of main streets, the line of the old walls. But the flesh that covered those bones would seem strange and new. The wooden buildings leaning into narrow streets, the churches rising where temples had stood, this simpler, smaller scale of public buildings. Yet for all these changes, life continued. Markets still filled with people each morning. Children still played in squares and alleyways. Artisans still practiced crafts in workshops, though with simpler tools and techniques. The cities of Italy had found new ways to live amid the remnants of ancient grandeur. As Roman ways persisted in Italian cities and flourished in the east, a different story unfolded in the northern provinces. In the lands we now call France and Britain, Roman cities faced greater challenges. Here, urban life didn't just change. In many places it nearly vanished. Yet even in these distant provinces, the ghost of Roman order never completely disappeared. In Gaul, Roman cities had thrived for centuries. From Lugdunum, Leon in the east to Burdigala, Bordeaux in the west. From Augusta Treverorum, Trier in the north to Narbo Martius, Narbonne in the south. Dozens of well-planned urban centres had spread Latin culture through what had once been Celtic lands. These cities followed the familiar pattern. Straight streets crossing at right angles, forums for business and politics, aqueducts bringing fresh water, amphitheatres hosting entertainments, and stone walls providing protection. By the late 5th century, as imperial control faded, these Gallo-Roman cities entered a period of dramatic change. Walls that once enclosed thriving neighbourhoods now surrounded half-empty spaces. Forums fell silent as trade declined. Public buildings crumbled without maintenance. The sound of Latin in the streets mixed with the Germanic tongues of Frankish newcomers. Lutetia, the Roman city on the Seine that would later become Paris, shows this transformation clearly. The city had been built primarily on the left bank of the Seine, centred on a forum near what is now the Rue Soufflot. A network of straight streets connected public buildings, baths, and an amphitheatre that could seat 15,000 people. By 500, much of this area stood empty. The population had retreated to the Ile de la Cité, the island in the middle of the river. Here, behind water barriers and hasty fortifications, perhaps 3,000 people lived, a tiny fraction of the former population. Across Gaul, a similar pattern played out. In Augusta Treverorum, Trier, which had served as an imperial capital in the 4th century, the massive Roman building stood mostly empty or repurposed. The great throne hall became a count's residence. The amphitheatre served as a quarry for building stone. Yet some Roman structures remained in use. The Porta Nigra, the massive black gate built by Roman engineers, continued to guard the northern approach to the city. Tours, the city made famous by its Bishop Gregory, whose history of the Franks provides our best window into this period, contracted dramatically. The Roman walls enclosed an area of about 200,000 square metres, but by Gregory's time in the 6th century, the inhabited section had shrunk to just the southeastern corner near the cathedral. The rest of the walled area contained gardens, ruins, and open spaces where weeds grew between fallen columns. In some Gallic cities, the Forum, once the heart of urban life, became a cemetery. Archaeological digs in Arles, Marseille, and other southern cities have uncovered burials from the 6th and 7th centuries placed directly in what had been the main public square. The central gathering place for the living had become a resting place for the dead, a powerful symbol of how thoroughly urban traditions had changed. Water systems decayed across the region. The complex Roman aqueducts required constant maintenance that post-Roman authorities couldn't manage. In Nemausus, Nimes, the magnificent Pont du Gard aqueduct gradually fell out of use. City dwellers returned to river water or wells, often resulting in poorer health and more frequent disease outbreaks. Street levels rose steadily through these centuries as debris accumulated without systematic clearing. In Lyon, archaeological work shows Roman pavements lying several feet below medieval streets. The neat grid pattern of Roman streets gradually disappeared as buildings encroached on public spaces and new paths formed through abandoned areas. Amidst this decline, the church emerged as the main keeper of urban tradition. Cathedrals rose on prominent sites, often near former forums. Bishops took over many functions once handled by Roman officials, organising basic services and representing their communities to new rulers. The Roman urban grid might fade, but the bishop's cathedral became a new organising point for city life. Across the Channel in Britannia, urban decline was even more pronounced. Roman withdrawal happened earlier here, and connections to Mediterranean culture weakened faster. By the mid-5th century, when Germanic settlers began arriving in larger numbers, many Roman British cities were already shadows of their former selves. Londinium, once a thriving port and provincial capital, tells this story clearly. By 450, the grand public buildings stood empty. The Forum no longer hosted markets or civic gatherings. The amphitheatre sat silent. Archaeological evidence shows that some streets were already covered by a layer of dark earth, a mix of decayed organic matter suggesting the land had returned to agricultural use. The population had dwindled to perhaps a few hundred people living among the ruins. Verulamium, near modern St Albans, offers even more dramatic evidence. Excavations reveal that by the early 5th century, wooden structures had replaced stone buildings in many areas. The sophisticated underfloor heating systems, hypocausts, were no longer maintained. Coins, the lifeblood of Roman economic life, virtually disappeared from the archaeological record. By 500, the city that had once housed thousands contained just scattered farmsteads within its crumbling walls. In some British cities, there may have been complete abandonment. At Caliva Atrebatum, modern Silchester, excavations suggest the city was systematically deserted. No Anglo-Saxon settlement replaced the Roman town. The site remained largely untouched, preserving Roman street patterns under farmers' fields until archaeologists began uncovering them centuries later. Yet not all was abandonment and decay. York, Roman Iberacum, maintained some urban functions, though on a much smaller scale. The Roman fortress area became a power centre for Northumbrian kings. Written sources mention continued occupation, though archaeological evidence shows much of the Roman city lay vacant. Similarly, Canterbury, Duravernum Cantiacorum, preserved a degree of importance due to its early Christian connections, even as its population shrank dramatically. In both Gaul and Britain, a key development was the changing position of towns within the larger settlement pattern. Roman cities had dominated their regions economically and politically. In the post-Roman world, power shifted to rural estates controlled by warrior elites. Cities became less important as centres of power and wealth. Many aristocrats now lived in country villas or wooden halls rather than urban houses. The first signs of urban revival came in Merovingian Gaul during the 7th century. Under kings like Dagobert I, 629–639, some cities saw modest renewal. Royal patronage funded new churches and monasteries that served as economic engines for their communities. In Paris, the great abbey of Saint-Denis, though outside the city itself, created commercial connections that helped revitalise the old Roman centre. The sound of construction returned to cities that had seen mostly decay for generations. This revival remained limited, however. Merovingian cities were very different from their Roman predecessors. Streets followed irregular paths rather than straight lines. Wooden buildings replaced stone in many areas. Markets operated on a smaller scale, with less specialised goods and more limited trade connections. A more significant urban revival began under Charlemagne and his successors in the late 8th and 9th centuries. The Carolingian Renaissance included attempts to restore some Roman urban functions. Charlemagne established palaces in old Roman centres like Aachen, Roman Aquae Grani, where he built a magnificent palace chapel inspired by Byzantine models. His administrators issued regulations for urban markets and attempted to standardise weights and measures. Carolingian coins bearing city names show the economic importance of places like Quentovic, Dorestad, and Lyon. These coins circulated along revived trade routes, connecting the empire to both Byzantine and Islamic markets. Urban craftsmen once again produced luxury goods for elite consumption, though not on the scale of Roman times. In Britain, urban revival came later and from different sources. The establishment of defended bourgs, fortified settlements by King Alfred the Great and his successors in the late 9th century, created new urban centres, some on former Roman sites. Winchester, London and York gradually regained importance as population centres, though their layout and functioning differed greatly from their Roman predecessors. Archaeological evidence reveals this slow transition across northern Europe. In Cologne, excavation shows 7th century wooden structures built directly atop the ruins of Roman stone buildings. By the 9th century, small stone structures appear again, though simpler than Roman counterparts. Similar patterns appear in Tours, where Carolingian layers show increasing construction, but still at a far smaller scale than Roman times. Pottery finds tell the same story. Locally made, simple wares replace the standardized, mass-produced Roman ceramics that had once been traded across the empire. By Carolingian times, higher quality goods appear again, but distribution remains more limited than in Roman days. Metal objects became much scarcer in urban contexts. Where Roman layers might yield hundreds of coins, nails, tools, and decorative items, early medieval levels contained far fewer metal artifacts. This reflects both economic simplification and the practice of carefully reusing valuable materials rather than discarding them. Street surfaces show the changing urban environment. Roman streets featured carefully laid stone paving. Early medieval streets were often just dirt paths, sometimes with scattered stones or timber planks in important areas. Not until the later medieval period would well-paved streets return to northern cities. Through all these changes, however, the Roman legacy remained visible. City walls, though often repaired with less skill, followed Roman lines. Main streets, even when narrowed and twisted, often preserved the direction of Roman roads. Churches and palaces rose on the foundations of Roman buildings, sometimes incorporating ancient columns or carved stones. Most importantly, the very concept of the city as a distinct kind of settlement lived on. Though greatly changed in form and function, medieval cities in Gaul and Britain remained special places, centres of religion, trade, and eventually learning. The urban tradition weakened but never died completely, waiting for the right conditions to flourish once more. As night settled over these transformed landscapes, the outlines of Roman walls would still be visible against the darkening sky. Inside these ancient enclosures, small clusters of lights mark the homes of those who kept urban life alive during its darkest hours. Their modest settlements contained the seeds of what would eventually grow into the great medieval cities of northern Europe. As cities in Gaul and Britannia followed their unique paths through the early medieval period, a different urban story unfolded across the mountains to the south. In Hispania, the Roman name for the Iberian Peninsula, cities experienced three dramatic transformations over 5 centuries. First came the Roman legacy, then Visigothic rule, and finally Islamic governance. Each layer built upon the earlier ones, creating some of the most distinctive and innovative urban centres of medieval Europe. Roman Hispania had boasted dozens of thriving cities: Tarraco, modern Tarragona, Emerita Augusta, Merida, Caesar Augusta, Zaragoza, Hispalis, Seville, and Cordoba stood among the most impressive provincial centres of the empire. These cities featured the standard elements of Roman urban design: grid-pattern streets, forums, temples, theatres, amphitheatres, aqueducts, and public baths. Some even had circuses for chariot racing, marking them as truly important regional capitals. The Roman withdrawal from Hispania came gradually in the early 5th century as imperial control weakened. Into this power vacuum stepped various Germanic peoples, Suevi, Vandals, and Alans, who crossed the Pyrenees in 409. After brief periods of chaos, the Visigoths emerged as the dominant power, establishing a kingdom that would rule most of the peninsula for nearly 3 centuries. The Visigoths, unlike some Germanic peoples, admired Roman culture and worked to preserve many of its elements. When they established their capital at Toledo in central Hispania, they maintained the city's Roman street layout and walls. Toledo's dramatic hilltop location, surrounded on 3 sides by the Tagus River, made it naturally defensible. The Visigoths strengthened its fortifications but kept the basic urban structure intact. Inside Toledo's walls, the Visigothic kings built new churches and palaces, often using stones from Roman buildings. These structures combined Roman architectural techniques with Germanic decorative elements. Intricate metalwork, geometric patterns, and horseshoe arches that would later influence Islamic design. The city became a seat of learning, with King Reciswinth establishing a law code in 654 that blended Roman legal principles with Germanic customs. Daily life in Visigothic Toledo combined Roman and Germanic elements. Latin remained the written language, though spoken by fewer people. Markets still operated in former Roman squares. Water still flowed through maintained Roman aqueducts. But new Gothic nobles now occupied the grandest houses, and the sound of Germanic speech mixed with vulgar Latin in the streets. In Merida, another important Visigothic centre, the transformation followed similar patterns. This city had been one of Roman Hispania's jewels, filled with monumental buildings. The Visigoths maintained the massive Roman bridge spanning the Guadiana River, over 2,600 feet long with 60 arches. They converted the Roman Temple of Diana into a palace for their nobles. The city's Roman walls received new towers and reinforcements. Merida's character changed significantly, however. Its enormous Roman theatre and amphitheatre fell into disuse, their stones carried away for new buildings. Streets narrowed as residents built structures encroaching on the once broad Roman avenues. The Grand Roman Forum became a marketplace with wooden stalls. The urban population shrank, clustering in certain neighbourhoods while others stood empty or became gardens within the walls. Barcelona, Roman Barcino, under the Visigoths remained a smaller but significant coastal city. Its compact Roman walls stayed intact, enclosing a typical grid pattern of streets. The Visigoths built their royal palace directly atop the remains of the Roman governor's residence, symbolically claiming Roman authority. Churches rose in what had been Roman temple precincts. Archaeological evidence from these and other Visigothic cities reveals a gradual simplification of urban life. Public baths closed as their heating systems broke down without skilled maintenance. Sophisticated drainage systems failed. Wooden buildings replaced stone in many areas. Yet cities survived as centres of authority, trade and religion, simpler than their Roman predecessors but still recognisably urban in function. The most dramatic transformation of Hispania's cities came after 711, when Muslim armies crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered most of the peninsula within 7 years. This rapid conquest brought new rulers with different urban traditions. While cities in northern Gaul and Britain were contracting further, those in what Muslims called Al-Andalus entered a remarkable period of growth and innovation. Córdoba emerged as the capital of this new Islamic province, later becoming an independent emirate and then caliphate. Under Abd al-Rahman and his successors, this former Roman city on the Guadalquivir River transformed into one of the world's most sophisticated urban centres. By the 10th century, Córdoba claimed perhaps 100,000 residents, dwarfing any city in Christian Europe. The physical transformation of Córdoba followed Islamic urban patterns while incorporating Roman foundations. The rectangular Roman street grid gradually gave way to a more organic network of narrower, winding streets and dead-end alleys that provided privacy for family homes. The Great Mosque, begun in 784 and expanded several times, rose on the site of a Visigothic church, which itself had replaced a Roman temple. Roman columns were reused in this magnificent building, supporting rows of distinctive red and white striped arches. The sounds and smells of Córdoba changed dramatically. The call to prayer echoed 5 times daily from minarets, markets filled with new spices and perfumes from the east. The Arabic language gradually replaced Latin and Gothic in public life, though many residents continued speaking Romance dialects that would eventually evolve into Spanish. Seville, another major centre of Al-Andalus, underwent similar changes. The Muslims strengthened its Roman walls and built a great mosque where the cathedral now stands. The former Roman Forum became the main esuk, marketplace, filled with specialised sections for different trades. Spice merchants in one area, leather workers in another, booksellers in a third. Above the city rose the minaret of the mosque, later converted into the bell tower known as the Giralda. Across Al-Andalus, Islamic urban planning introduced innovations that dramatically improved city life. Water management reached new levels of sophistication, building upon but far surpassing Roman systems. In the dry climate of southern Spain, Muslim engineers developed complex networks of canals, fountains, public baths and ornamental pools. They perfected the Noria water wheel technology, creating efficient systems for raising water from rivers to supply urban needs. The sensory experience of these Islamic cities contrasted sharply with those in the Christian north. Courtyard houses with interior gardens provided private green spaces filled with fragrant orange trees and flowers. Public fountains brought the cooling sound of water to city squares. Markets displayed colourful silks and ceramics alongside mountains of spices. The streets filled with the sounds of Arabic, Berber and Romance languages as a diverse population went about daily business. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Andalusian cities was their cultural synthesis. In major centres like Toledo, recaptured by Christians in 1085 but retaining much of its Islamic character, Córdoba and Seville, Muslims, Christians and Jews lived in separate but neighbouring districts. Each community maintained its own religious buildings, legal systems and customs while participating in a shared urban economy and culture. This cultural blending produced remarkable results. In Toledo, translation schools brought together scholars of all 3 faiths to render Arabic scientific and philosophical texts into Latin, helping trigger Europe's intellectual revival. In Córdoba's libraries, classic Greek works preserved through Arabic translations survived when their original versions were lost elsewhere. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides developed ideas that would influence thinking in all 3 religious traditions. The architectural legacy of this synthesis remains visible today. The term mudéjar describes the distinctively Spanish style that combined Islamic decorative elements with Christian structures. Horseshoe arches, intricate geometric tile work, and ornate plasterwork adorned churches and palaces built long after the Christian reconquest. Even in northern cities that spent relatively little time under Islamic rule, this cultural influence appears in buildings constructed centuries later. As Christian kingdoms gradually pushed southward during the Reconquista, captured Islamic cities faced another transformation. Some, like Toledo, maintained much of their Islamic urban character under Christian rule. Others underwent significant remodelling to emphasize their new Christian identity. Main mosques became cathedrals, minarets became bell towers, and Islamic palaces housed Christian nobles. Yet the practical innovations of Islamic urban design, especially water management systems, often remained in use under Christian rule. The narrow winding streets pattern persisted in many southern cities rather than returning to the Roman grid. Courtyards continued providing the organisational principle for domestic architecture. Markets maintained their specialised sections for different trades, a practice that continued into modern times. By the late medieval period, cities across the Iberian Peninsula reflected their layered history. Roman foundations, Visigothic modifications, Islamic innovations, and finally Christian adaptations of all these elements. A visitor walking through Toledo, Cordoba, or Seville would pass Roman walls, Visigothic churches, Islamic mosques or their converted remains, and Christian cathedrals incorporating elements from all these traditions. Water still flowed through pipes and channels first laid by Roman engineers, improved by Islamic hydraulic experts, and maintained by Christian city councils. Streets still followed paths established during these earlier periods. Markets still operated in spaces that had served commercial functions for 1,000 years or more. Few regions in Europe displayed such visible layers of urban continuity and change across the centuries. The cities of medieval Hispania thus offer a different model of urban development than those we observed in Gaul and Britain. Rather than dramatic contraction and simplification, they experience cultural synthesis and periodic renewal. Their story reminds us that urban decline was not inevitable after Rome's fall, and that new influences could reinvigorate rather than replace ancient patterns of city life. As the cities of Hispania blended Islamic, Christian, and Jewish influences in the West, another kind of urban revival began taking shape across the Mediterranean. The land that had given birth to Rome entered a remarkable period of renewal. Italian cities, which had shrunk and simplified during the early medieval centuries, now experienced dramatic growth and transformation. Streets that had been quiet for generations filled again with the sounds of commerce, construction, and civic life. The age of the medieval communes had begun. This revival started gradually in the 11th century. Northern Italian cities like Milan, Pisa, Venice, Genoa, and Florence slowly gained strength through trade and local production. Unlike cities in other regions, which often remained under royal or noble control, these Italian urban centres developed new forms of self-government. The commune, a sworn association of citizens who governed together, emerged as a distinctive political form. These communes began when groups of citizens, typically merchants and craftsmen, joined together to defend their interests against local nobles or distant emperors. In Milan around 1075, urban residents formed an organisation they called the Pataria, that challenged both the archbishop's authority and the distant German emperor. Similar movements appeared in other northern cities. By 1100, many had established consuls, elected officials who governed collectively rather than individually. You could see and hear this new civic spirit in the central squares of these growing towns. Citizens gathered in public assemblies called parlamenti or arenghi, where important decisions were announced and debated. The ringing of the town bell summoned people to these meetings. One bell might call council members to session, while a different pattern summoned all citizens in times of emergency. The sound of these bells became the voice of urban independence. Physical changes accompanied this political transformation. Towns that had occupied only a fraction of their old Roman walls began expanding again. In Florence, the walls built in 1078 enclosed an area 4 times larger than the early medieval city. By 1175, the population had grown so much that another wall was needed. Across northern Italy, similar growth occurred as rural people moved to cities seeking opportunity and freedom. These expanding cities offered something precious to medieval people, a path to freedom. An old German saying captured this principle: Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. Serfs who lived in towns for a year and a day could claim legal freedom from their lords. This drew ambitious peasants hoping to improve their condition through urban crafts and trade. The physical fabric of these growing cities reflected their new confidence and wealth. Streets that had become crooked paths during the early medieval period were straightened and paved. Wooden buildings gave way to stone structures. Bridges spanned rivers with permanent stone arches rather than wooden spans. Public fountains supplied fresh water. Drainage systems carried away waste. The sensory experience of urban life improved as a result. Less mud, less stench, more order and cleanliness. At the heart of each commune rose new buildings that symbolized civic pride and identity. The public palace, Palazzo Pubblico or Palazzo Comunale, housed the government and dominated the main square. These massive stone buildings, often crowned with tall towers, represented the commune's authority and independence. Inside, council chambers featured seating arrangements that emphasized equality among the governing citizens. Nearby stood another essential structure, the cathedral. Though religious rather than civic in purpose, these churches represented the city's prestige and wealth. Communes competed to build larger and more magnificent cathedrals than their neighbours. Pisa began its famous cathedral complex in 1063, with the baptistery and leaning tower added later. Siena's striped marble cathedral, started in the early 1200s, was planned to be even larger until plague interrupted the work. Between the civic palace and the cathedral, the main square, piazza, formed the centre of urban life. Here citizens gathered for announcements, celebrations and markets. The sound of negotiations and street vendors filled the air during market days. Religious processions wound through these spaces on feast days. Public executions and punishments reminded all of the commune's authority to maintain order. The rebuilt cities incorporated Roman remains in fascinating ways. In Verona, houses and shops nestled into the arches of the ancient arena. In Florence, the ancient street grid remained visible in the oldest neighbourhoods, though medieval buildings now defined the spaces. In Lucca, the oval shape of the main square followed the outline of a Roman amphitheatre, with medieval houses built into its shell. The physical presence of ancient grandeur served as both practical building resource and symbolic connection to past glory. These cities built their renewed prosperity on several foundations. Manufacturing, especially of textiles, created wealth and employment. Florence became famous for its woolen cloth production. By 1300, about 30% of the city's population worked in the wool trade. Workshops clustered in specialized districts, filling narrow streets with the sounds of looms, the smell of dyes, and the bustle of workers. Banking developed as another key industry. Money changing had always been necessary in areas where different coinage systems met, but Italian merchants developed more sophisticated financial instruments. Letters of credit allowed merchants to travel without carrying coins. Deposit banking, loans and investments created a complex financial system. The smell of ink and parchment, the scratch of quill pens, and the quiet conversations of serious men marked these early banking houses. Trade networks spread from Italian cities across the Mediterranean and into northern Europe. Venetian and Genoese ships carried goods between east and west. The smells of exotic spices, the sight of colourful silks, and the sounds of different languages in the harbours testified to these far-reaching connections. Merchant colonies in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other distant ports extended Italian influence abroad. This urban revival wasn't limited to the northern communes. Rome, though following a different path, experienced its own renewal under papal leadership. After centuries of decline that had reduced the ancient imperial capital to a collection of small settlements among magnificent ruins, the city began a slow recovery. The papacy, having gained greater independence from both Byzantine and Frankish control, initiated ambitious building projects. Pope Leo IV responded to devastating Arab raids by constructing walls around the Vatican area in 848 or 852, creating what became known as the Leonine City. Later popes renovated ancient churches and built new ones. The area around St. Peter's Basilica developed into an administrative centre for the growing papal government. Pilgrims from across Christendom brought both revenue and prestige as they visited Rome's many holy sites. Unlike the northern communes, Rome remained under clear papal authority rather than developing republican institutions. The ancient Senate, which had disappeared for centuries, was revived in the 12th century but held limited power compared to the Pope and noble families. The city's economy centred on serving the papal court and the steady stream of pilgrims rather than manufacturing or international trade. The physical revival of Rome proceeded more slowly than in northern cities. Many ancient monuments continued to decay or were mined for building materials. The Forum remained the Campo Vaccino, cowfield, where animals grazed among fallen columns. The population, though growing, occupied only a fraction of the space within the ancient Aurelian walls. Yet impressive new towers, churches, and fortified family compounds rose among the ruins, creating a distinctive cityscape that blended ancient grandeur with medieval functionality. Across Italy, this urban renaissance brought social changes too. New occupational groups gained importance in urban society. Notaries who drafted legal documents, physicians trained in medical schools, and lawyers who managed the increasingly complex legal affairs of communes formed a professional class. Guilds organised craftsmen and merchants, regulating quality standards and training new members through apprenticeship systems. Urban culture developed distinctive features. Public festivals combined religious devotion with civic pride. Saints' days became occasions for elaborate processions, feasts and competitions between city neighbourhoods. In Siena, the famous Palio horse race began during this period. In Florence, the Feast of San Giovanni featured parades, games and displays of the city's wealth. The sounds of music, the bright colours of festival banners, and the smell of feast day foods marked these celebrations. Literacy spread more widely in these commercial cities than in rural feudal society. Merchants needed to keep records, read contracts, and correspond with distant partners. By the late 13th century, many Italian cities had established schools teaching practical mathematics and literacy for commercial purposes. The scratching of chalk on counting boards and the recitation of multiplication tables became common sounds in urban neighbourhoods. The new wealth created by urban economies allowed for cultural developments that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. The 13th century saw the emergence of vernacular literature in Tuscany, most notably in Dante's works. Universities at Bologna and Padua became centres of legal and medical education. Churches and civic buildings incorporated increasingly sophisticated art and architecture. Not all aspects of this urban revival were positive. Class tensions developed between wealthy merchant families and ordinary workers. Political factions formed, often leading to violent conflicts in city streets. Towers built by powerful families served not just as status symbols, but as defensive structures during urban fighting. Many communes eventually lost their republican institutions as powerful families established hereditary control, creating signory, lordships, that maintained the forms of communal government while concentrating actual power in few hands. Environmental problems accompanied urban growth. Crowded conditions, inadequate sanitation, and the concentration of people made cities vulnerable to disease. The narrow streets filled with human and animal waste during rainstorms. Industrial processes like tanning and dyeing polluted urban streams. Smoke from workshops and household fires darkened the air. City governments passed regulations attempting to control these problems, with varying success. Still, the overall trajectory was one of growth and increasing sophistication. By 1300, Italy had become the most urbanized region in Europe. Milan, Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Naples each housed over 50,000 people, enormous populations by medieval standards. Dozens of smaller cities flourished as regional centres. The network of economic, political, and cultural connections among these urban centres created a distinctive civilization that would soon lead Europe into the Renaissance. As Italian cities flourished with their communal movements and trade networks, different urban patterns took shape across the rest of what had once been the Western Roman Empire. In Gaul, Britain, and the Germanic lands, cities developed along paths distinct from their Mediterranean counterparts. Though many grew from Roman roots, their form and function evolved to meet the needs of medieval society. From cathedral precincts to trading centres, from university towns to administrative hubs, these urban places created a varied landscape of civic life across Europe. The most visible transformation of former Roman centres came through the cathedral. By the 11th century, bishops had firmly established their seats in old Roman cities. The bishop's church, the cathedral, became the defining feature of urban space. Unlike the Roman city with its forum at the centre, the medieval cathedral city organised itself around the great church and its surrounding complex. Pilgrims, merchants, and travellers approached these cities to find massive stone towers rising above the walls, visible for miles across the countryside. These towers served both practical and symbolic purposes. They housed bells that regulated urban life with their daily calls to prayer, and they proclaimed the church's central role in society. In cities like Cologne along the Rhine, the Roman street grid still shaped the central area, but the grand cathedral now dominated the skyline where temples had once stood. Begun in 1248, this enormous Gothic structure would take over 6 centuries to complete. Meanwhile, its construction site became a permanent feature of urban life, with generations of stonemasons, carpenters, and labourers at work. The sounds of hammers and chisels, the creaking of wooden cranes, and the shouts of foremen became part of the city's daily rhythm. Canterbury in England shows how a cathedral complex could reshape a Roman city. The Roman town of Durovanum Cantiacorum had featured the standard grid plan with forum and temples. The medieval city kept some Roman streets but reorganised itself around the cathedral precinct. After a fire in 1174 destroyed much of the older church, master builder William of Sens created a magnificent new structure. Around it grew a walled enclosure containing the archbishop's palace, houses for clergy, a school, and a hospital. This complex formed almost a separate city within the city, with its own rules and governance. The cathedral was more than a religious building. It served as a community centre, marketplace, school, theatre for religious plays, and even occasional courtroom. On feast days, these vast spaces filled with people from every social class. The cool stone interior, lit by coloured lights streaming through stained glass, echoed with chanting, prayers, and sacred music. The scent of incense mixed with the smell of hundreds of candles and the earthy odour of the crowd. During important festivals, the cathedral and surrounding streets became the stage for elaborate processions, with relics of saints carried through the city, accompanied by clergy in colourful vestments, musicians, and crowds of citizens. Beyond the cathedral close, medieval cities developed specialised districts. Tanners worked near rivers. Their pungent chemicals kept downwind from residential areas. Metalworkers clustered in streets still bearing names like Coppergate or Smithfield centuries later. Bakers, butchers, and other food sellers gathered in market squares where their goods could be easily inspected by city officials. As trade increased during the 12th and 13th centuries, many small Roman settlements revived as market towns. These places often preserved a little of their Roman appearance besides fragments of walls or street alignments, yet they stood on the same well-placed sites chosen by Roman surveyors, at river crossings, natural harbours, or junctions of old Roman roads that still formed the backbone of medieval transportation. Winchester in England demonstrates this transformation clearly. Once the Roman Venta Belgarum with its grid-planned streets and substantial public buildings, by Norman times it had become a thriving market town with a very different layout. The Roman grid had disappeared under centuries of rebuilding. Now a long high street ran through the centre, lined with narrow medieval buildings whose upper stories projected outward, nearly touching above the street. On market days, this street filled with wooden stalls offering goods from the surrounding countryside. Vegetables, cheeses, livestock, wool and leather goods. The calls of merchants, the bleating of sheep, the haggling of customers, and the cries of street sellers created a cacophony that echoed between the close-set buildings. These market towns operated under formal charters granted by kings or lords. Such charters gave towns the right to hold weekly markets and annual fairs, creating reliable trading centres across the countryside. The rhythms of these markets shaped life in surrounding regions. Peasants from miles around would time their work to allow visits on market day. Travelling merchants planned their routes around the established schedule of fairs throughout the year. In this way, even small market towns became important nodes in economic networks. One of the most distinctive urban forms that emerged during this period was the university town. From the 12th century onward, centres of higher learning developed in several ancient cities, creating a new kind of urban environment. Bologna, once the Roman Bononia, became home to Europe's oldest university. Growing from informal gatherings of law students in the late 11th century, it developed into a formal institution by 1158. The university had no central campus in the modern sense. Instead, lectures took place in rented rooms throughout the city. Students lived in boarding houses, creating neighbourhoods dominated by young men from across Europe. The sounds of these quarters, loud arguments in Latin, drunken singing in multiple languages, and the scratching of quill pens copying texts late into the night, became distinctive features of university towns. In Paris, the university grew on the left bank of the Seine, in an area once occupied by Roman baths and villas. By the early 13th century, masters and students clustered in the area still called the Latin Quarter. Here narrow streets filled with bookshops, parchment sellers, and copyists serving the academic community. The colleges that eventually became the heart of universities began as simple boarding houses for poor students. Over time, they developed into more complex institutions with their own buildings, libraries, and chapels. The university brought a different rhythm to urban life. Academic calendars structured the year, with terms and vacations creating regular flows of students and income. Degree ceremonies, scholarly debates, and student initiations became part of urban traditions. Town and gown tensions often erupted into conflicts, sometimes violent ones. The riot of 1355 in Oxford, which began with an argument over beer quality in a tavern, left dozens dead on both sides. While these new urban forms developed, many aspects of Roman legal and administrative practice remained surprisingly intact. Medieval urban law frequently built upon Roman foundations. In southern France and Italy particularly, aspects of Roman civil law continued with little interruption. Town charters often included principles drawn from ancient legal codes. The concept of the corporation, a body with legal identity separate from its members, derived from Roman law and proved essential for medieval urban governance. Administrative practices showed similar continuities. Many cities maintained some form of municipal council, though now composed of guildmasters and wealthy merchants rather than Roman aristocrats. Record-keeping systems, tax assessment methods, and procedures for resolving property disputes often reflected Roman antecedents. Even the physical instruments of administration, seals, documents, and record books, followed formats with Roman origins. City walls illustrate the complex relationship between Roman foundations and medieval adaptations. Many cities maintained and extended their Roman walls throughout the medieval period. In Tours, the late Roman wall enclosing just the southeastern corner of the ancient city remained the secure centre, with new suburbs eventually growing beyond it. As these suburbs developed, they gained their own walls, creating a pattern of concentric defences marking different phases of urban growth. Cologne built directly on its Roman foundations when constructing new medieval walls. Workers incorporated Roman towers and gates into the new defences, creating hybrid structures bridging centuries. Street names preserved memories of Roman functions long after those functions had disappeared. The Via Sacra, or Strada Maggiore in many Italian towns, followed the course of the main Roman thoroughfare. Markets often occupied spaces that had been forums. In London, the name Cheapside, from the Old English seep meaning market, marked the commercial street that had been a bustling area since Roman times. Perhaps the most profound change from Roman to medieval urban patterns came in the demographic landscape. Roman cities had housed substantial populations, often tens of thousands in provincial capitals. After the contractions of the early medieval period, most cities remained much smaller. A substantial medieval town might contain just 5,000 to 10,000 residents. Only major centres like Paris, with perhaps 80,000 people by 1300, approached the scale of significant Roman cities. The social makeup of urban populations shifted dramatically too. Roman cities had been dominated by imperial officials, wealthy landowners who maintained townhouses, and a substantial middle class of artisans and traders. Medieval cities contained fewer administrative officials, particularly in northern Europe where royal governments were less centralized. The church hierarchy, bishops, canons, priests, and monks, formed a much larger portion of the urban elite than in Roman times. A crucial new element in medieval urban society was the guild system. Craftsmen and merchants organized themselves into associations that regulated quality standards, prices, and training. These guilds became fundamental building blocks of urban governance, with guildmasters often forming city councils. The physical landscape reflected this social organization, with guild halls becoming prominent urban buildings, especially in northern European cities. The most dramatic demographic change came in the late medieval period, as cities faced the devastation of plague. The Black Death of 1347-1351 struck urban centres with particular ferocity, sometimes killing a third or more of city dwellers in a single outbreak. Yet cities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Economic opportunity drew new migrants from the countryside to replace the dead. Within a generation or two, most cities had recovered their population losses, though often with a very different mix of families and origins than before the plague. Despite all these transformations, medieval cities maintained a powerful sense of connection to their Roman past. Town chronicles proudly recorded Roman origins, sometimes with fanciful embellishments. City seals and coins displayed Roman imagery. When Renaissance humanists began systematically studying classical texts in the 14th and 15th centuries, they found eager audiences in cities proud of their ancient heritage. As night fell across these transformed urban landscapes, the medieval city presented a very different sensory experience from its Roman predecessor, where Roman streets had been lit by oil lamps and remained active late into the evening. Medieval cities generally grew dark and quiet after sunset. The curfew, announced by church bells, marked the time when city gates closed and streets emptied. Only the occasional patrol of the night watch, carrying torches and calling the hours, broke the darkness. From cathedral towers, the bells that had structured the day fell silent until dawn. Prayers would again waken the city to a new day. As the sun rose over the medieval city, its light caught the weathered stones of buildings that often stood on Roman foundations. The narrow streets, which had once been wide Roman avenues, began to fill with the sounds of a new day. Wooden shutters opened on upper floors. Smoke from morning cooking fires rose from countless chimneys. The day in a medieval town built upon ancient Roman roots was beginning. For those living in these cities during the 12th and 13th centuries, daily life unfolded in spaces that mixed old and new in fascinating ways. Roman walls might still stand, but the buildings within them had changed dramatically. Streets that had once been straight now twisted and turned through neighbourhoods that had grown without planning. Yet beneath the surface, the patterns of Roman city life continued to influence how people lived, worked, and worshipped. Housing in medieval cities reflected both wealth and history. The homes of ordinary people were typically simple wooden structures built on narrow plots. These tall, thin houses often had just one room per floor, stacked 3 or 4 stories high. The ground floor usually served as a workshop or shop with living quarters above. Windows were small, covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters rather than glass, which remained a luxury. Roofs covered with thatch or wooden shingles created a constant fire hazard, leading many cities to pass laws requiring tile or slate roofing. Inside these modest homes, furniture was sparse. A table and benches, a chest for clothing, and perhaps a cupboard for dishes might be all a family owned. Beds were often simple mattresses filled with straw or wool placed on platforms or chests. At night the family slept together for warmth, with parents and children sharing the same space. Privacy, as we understand it today, was largely unknown to medieval urban dwellers. The smells inside these homes told the story of daily life. The sweet scent of herbs hung drying from ceiling beams mixed with the stronger odours of cooking, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present smoke. Without chimneys in many simpler homes, smoke from cooking fires found its way out through a hole in the roof, filling the upper rooms before escaping. The earthen or wooden floors were often scattered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs to combat odours and insects. Wealthy merchants and nobles enjoyed far more comfort in their stone townhouses. These larger structures sometimes incorporated pieces of Roman buildings, a column here, carved stones there. Inside, tapestries covered walls, providing both decoration and insulation against the cold. Wooden floors replaced earth, and glass windows allowed light while keeping out wind and rain. Multiple fireplaces with proper chimneys made these homes warmer and less smoky than their poorer neighbours. Water came from public fountains and wells scattered throughout the city. In some places, particularly in Italy and southern France, ancient Roman aqueducts still functioned, bringing fresh water from distant sources. Women and children made daily trips to these water sources, carrying heavy jugs and buckets home. This daily gathering created natural meeting places where news and gossip spread through the community. The sounds of craft work filled medieval streets during daylight hours. Unlike modern cities with separate industrial zones, medieval production happened everywhere. The steady beat of the blacksmith's hammer, the whir of the potter's wheel, the clacking of looms and the tap of the cobbler's mallet created a constant background noise from dawn until dusk. Each craft typically occupied its own street or neighbourhood, a pattern that lives on in street names like Tanner's Lane or Silversmith Street. This clustering made practical sense. Crafts that needed water clustered near streams or fountains, those requiring fire stayed close together for safety, and foul-smelling trades like tanning were pushed to the city edges. The medieval craft system operated through guilds, organisations that controlled who could practice a trade and set standards for their work. Becoming a craftsman meant years of training, starting as an apprentice at perhaps age 7. After learning basic skills for 5 to 7 years, the young person became a journeyman, working for daily wages. Only after creating a masterpiece that demonstrated their skill could they hope to become a master craftsman with their own shop. These guild workshops were typically small, with a master working alongside 1 or 2 journeymen and a few apprentices. In the cloth industry, the largest medieval industry, different guilds handled each production stage. Weavers, dyers, fullers and tailors each performed their specialised role, with cloth moving from shop to shop before becoming a finished garment. Markets pulsed at the heart of commerce in medieval cities built on Roman foundations. Many still operated in spaces that had been Roman forums, though now crowded with temporary wooden stalls rather than surrounded by marble colonnades. Daily markets provided fresh food, vegetables from nearby gardens, bread from city bakers, meat from butchers, and fish carried in on wagons packed with ice or rushes. Larger weekly markets drew farmers and merchants from the surrounding countryside. The noise level rose dramatically on these days as sellers shouted to attract customers, animals squawked and bellowed in temporary pens, and hundreds of people haggled over prices. The smells intensified too. Fresh produce and flowers mixed with the less pleasant odours of livestock, fish and sweaty crowds. Annual fairs, lasting days or even weeks, brought merchants from far greater distances. In cities with Roman roots, these often coincided with ancient festival dates, though now celebrated for Christian saints rather than Roman gods. Some of the largest, like the Champagne fairs in France, drew traders from across Europe and beyond, creating temporary commercial cities with their own rules and courts. The sounds of commerce included specialised cries that identified street vendors, the knife sharpener's distinctive call, the pie seller's rhyming advertisement, the charcoal seller's deep shout. Each created a recognised audio signature that let people identify who was passing, even without seeing them. This sonic landscape would have been instantly recognisable to any medieval city dweller, but completely foreign to modern ears. Religion dominated both physical space and daily rhythms in these cities. The cathedral, often built on the site of a Roman temple or important public building, towered over surrounding structures. Its bells marked the hours of the day, calling people to prayer and announcing important events. The deep tones of the great bell could be heard for miles, while smaller bells created different rings for different purposes. Inside the cathedral, medieval people experienced a sensory richness that contrasted sharply with their often plain homes. Coloured light streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating clouds of incense smoke that rose toward the vaulted ceiling. Gold and silver gleamed on the altar. The voices of the choir echoed through the vast space. For ordinary people whose daily lives were often drab and difficult, these moments of beauty and transcendence held enormous power. Beyond the cathedral, parish churches served local neighbourhoods. Many medieval cities contained dozens of these smaller churches, each forming the centre of community life for its district. Parishioners gathered not just for Mass but for announcements, celebrations, and during emergencies. Church porches served as meeting places and sometimes as informal courtrooms or locations for business deals. Monastic establishments added another layer to the religious landscape. In cities with Roman heritage, monasteries often occupied spaces that had been public buildings or elite Roman homes. Their walled compounds created quiet islands amid the noisy streets. The chanting of monks or nuns at their regular prayer services drifted over neighbourhood walls. Monastery bells added their distinctive tones to the cathedral's deeper sounds, creating a complex auditory religious calendar. Religious festivals punctuated the year with colour and excitement. Many preserved elements of Roman celebrations under Christian guise. The spring festivities of Easter incorporated older fertility themes. Midsummer celebrations for St. John's Day featured bonfires that recalled Roman sun worship. Christmas absorbed elements of Roman Saturnalia and winter solstice festivities. These religious celebrations transformed city spaces in ways that would have seemed familiar to ancient Romans, though with Christian symbols replacing pagan ones. Streets were decorated with branches and flowers. Processions carried sacred objects through the city, often following routes established centuries earlier for Roman triumphs or religious parades. Public performances, religious plays rather than gladiatorial combats, drew crowds to the same spaces where Romans had gathered for entertainment. Corpus Christi became one of the most important medieval urban festivals, with elaborate processions displaying the consecrated host through city streets. Guild members in their finest clothes accompanied the procession, often performing religious plays on wagons that stopped at key points. These performances turned the entire city into a theatre, with biblical stories unfolding against the backdrop of medieval streets built on Roman foundations. Daily rhythms followed patterns both ancient and new. The day began at dawn with church bells calling people to first prayers. Work started immediately afterward and continued until the midday meal, the largest of the day for most people. A brief rest during the hottest hours, especially in southern cities with strong Roman heritage, gave way to afternoon work until sunset. Evening brought a lighter meal, conversation by firelight or candles, and then early sleep for most, though taverns and some workshops continued operations into the night. The sensory experience of a medieval city would have overwhelmed modern visitors. Without sanitation systems, waste often ended up in streets. Animals lived within city walls. Chickens and pigs roamed freely, horses and donkeys transported goods, and rats thrived everywhere. After rain, streets became rivers of mud mixed with refuse. In dry weather, dust filled the air. Yet medieval people also created beauty within these challenging conditions. Window boxes brightened narrow streets with flowers. Songs and music spilled from open windows and workshops. On feast days, the scent of special foods, spiced wine, roasting meats, holiday breads, transformed the urban aroma. Markets displayed colourful textiles, shining metal wares, and fresh produce arranged to catch the eye. Social life centred on public spaces rather than private homes. The square before the cathedral, the marketplace, the public fountain, and taverns all served as gathering places where news spread and relationships formed. For women, trips to draw water or wash clothes created daily opportunities for conversation. For men, guild halls and taverns provided spaces for both business and pleasure. Children played in the streets, their games sometimes preserving elements of Roman pastimes. They rolled hoops, played with balls and tops, and engaged in mock battles. Young people found partners at church festivals and market gatherings, under the watchful eyes of family and neighbours. Marriage typically came early, mid-teens for girls, late teens or early 20s for boys, and was as much an economic partnership as a romantic one. Despite the challenges, medieval city dwellers developed strong attachments to their communities. Civic pride emerged in public building projects, in rivalry with neighbouring towns, and in elaborate celebrations of local saints and heroes. People identified strongly with their street, their parish, their guild and their city, seeing themselves as part of nested communities that gave meaning and structure to their lives. As night fell across these medieval cities built on Roman foundations, the transition from day to night was far more complete than in our modern world. Without streetlights, darkness transformed familiar spaces. The night watch made rounds with lanterns, calling the hours and watching for fires, the greatest urban danger. Most people retired to their homes, though the poor might share sleeping spaces in crowded tenements or seek shelter in church porches. By candlelight or firelight, families might share stories before sleep, some perhaps unconsciously preserving elements of tales once told in Latin in these same places centuries before. As the cathedral bells rang compline, the day's final prayer, the medieval city built on Roman stone settled into darkness, waiting for dawn to begin the cycle once again. As the medieval era advanced across Europe, the city-states of northern Italy reached heights of wealth, power and sophistication unmatched elsewhere. While their population might seem modest by modern standards, their influence extended far beyond their walls. Florence, Venice, and Milan emerged as centres of commerce, banking, art, and learning that would transform not just Italy, but all of European civilization. Among these remarkable urban communities, Florence stood as perhaps the most dynamic. Nestled in the valley of the Arno River in Tuscany, the city grew from a modest Roman settlement into a bustling centre of trade and industry. By 1300, Florence housed nearly 100,000 people within its walls. Visitors approaching the city saw its skyline dominated by the massive dome of the cathedral, later completed by Brunelleschi, and the soaring tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government. The streets of Florence pulsed with activity. The smell of dyed wool hung in the air around the workshops of the cloth merchants. The shouts of vendors and buyers filled the marketplace. The sound of hammers rang out from the workshops of goldsmiths and leather workers. Florence had grown rich primarily through its wool and banking industries. Florentine merchants imported raw wool from England, transformed it into fine cloth in their workshops, and exported the finished products throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. What made Florence truly remarkable, however, was its form of government. Unlike many cities that fell under the control of a single ruler or noble family, Florence developed a republican system. The city was governed by a series of councils drawn from the major guilds, organizations of merchants and craftsmen who controlled different industries. The Signoria, a council of 9 men selected by lot from the eligible guild members, held executive power for just 2 months at a time. This rapid rotation of office was designed to prevent any individual from gaining too much power. This republican system produced fierce civic pride. Florentines saw themselves as citizens rather than subjects. Public buildings were decorated with symbols of the Republic, the red lily on a white field, and statues representing civic virtues. The massive Palazzo Vecchio, with its crenellated tower rising nearly 100 metres above the main square, stood as a physical embodiment of communal authority and republican values. Venice presented a very different model of urban development. Built on a cluster of muddy islands in a lagoon, the city seemed to float on water. With no land for farming, Venetians turned to the sea for their livelihood. Their merchant fleets connected Europe to the markets of the East, bringing back spices, silk, and other luxury goods. The sound of water lapping against buildings, the calls of gondoliers, and the creak of moored ships created a unique urban soundscape, unlike any other European city. The physical layout of Venice reflected its unusual environment. Instead of streets, canals served as the main transportation routes. The Grand Canal, shaped like an inverted S, flowed through the heart of the city. Palatial homes of wealthy merchant families lined this waterway, their Byzantine and Gothic facades glowing with coloured marble and decorated with pointed arches and delicate tracery. Without space for horses or carts, Venetians moved goods by boat and travelled on foot across hundreds of small bridges that connected the city's islands. Venice developed its own distinctive form of republican government, more aristocratic than Florence's system. At its head stood the Doge, elected for life from among the city's noble families. But the Doge's power was carefully limited by a complex system of councils and committees dominated by the patrician class. The Great Council, which included all adult male nobles, formed the broadest governing body. Smaller councils like the Senate and the feared Council of 10 handled specific aspects of governance. The heart of Venetian public life was the Piazza San Marco, a vast open space flanked by the Doge's palace and the magnificent Byzantine-style Basilica of St. Mark. Here Venetians gathered for public ceremonies, festivals and proclamations. The Doge's palace housed not only the Doge's apartments, but the meeting rooms of various councils and courts. With its Gothic arches supported by a double colonnade, it presented a striking image of beauty and strength combined. Milan, the third great power of northern Italy, followed yet another path of development. Located on the fertile Lombard plain, the city controlled rich agricultural lands and important trade routes through the Alpine passes. Milan's prosperity came not just from trade but from manufacturing, particularly weapons and armour production. The sound of metal being worked filled many neighbourhoods, while the smell of smoke from forges hung in the air. Unlike Florence and Venice, Milan fell under the control of a seigneurial regime, ruled by a single lord or dynasty. The Visconti family and later the Sforzas established themselves as hereditary rulers of the city. From their fortress palace, the Castello Sforzesco, they governed not just Milan but an expanding territory in northern Italy. Milan thus evolved from a commune into a territorial state under strong centralized authority. The Visconti and Sforza rulers were often brutal in maintaining their power, but they also patronized spectacular building projects that transformed the cityscape. The massive Milan Cathedral, begun in 1386, rose slowly over generations, its white marble pinnacles and thousands of statues creating a stone forest that dominated the central square. The castello itself combined military strength with courtly refinement. Thick walls and defensive towers surrounded interior courtyards decorated with frescoes and gardens. Across these different city-states, certain common patterns of urban development emerged. Each city invested heavily in defences. Walls, gates and watchtowers protected urban wealth from outside threats. Public spaces served both practical and symbolic functions. Markets provided places for daily commerce, while grand squares offered settings for civic rituals that reinforced community identity. Public buildings, town halls, cathedrals, guild headquarters demonstrated the wealth and pride of these urban communities through their scale and decoration. Private building also transformed the urban landscape. Wealthy merchants and bankers constructed family palaces that served as both homes and business headquarters. In Florence, the Medici, Strozzi and Pitti families built massive stone palaces with rusticated facades that projected an image of solidity and power. In Venice, the unique conditions of building on water led to distinctive palaces with large central halls on the upper floors, elaborate facades facing the canals, and storage areas at water level for unloading goods directly from boats. The economic foundations of these city-states rested on sophisticated financial and commercial systems. Florence became Europe's banking centre, with Florentine banks establishing branches throughout the continent. The gold florin, first minted in 1252, became a standard international currency. Venetian merchants developed advanced accounting methods and insurance systems for their shipping ventures. Milan's rulers established one of the first public banks and implemented systematic taxation across their territories. These economic developments had profound social consequences. Unlike the three-estate system common in northern Europe, clergy, nobility, commoners, Italian cities developed more complex social hierarchies based largely on wealth rather than birth. While old noble families maintained influence, wealthy merchants could rise to prominence through commercial success. The popolo grosso, fat people or upper middle class, of successful business owners played key roles in governance. Below them stood small shopkeepers, skilled artisans and unskilled labourers. By the early 15th century, these wealthy, sophisticated urban societies began nurturing what we now recognise as the early Renaissance. The term itself, rebirth, reflected the conscious revival of classical learning and artistic forms. In Florence particularly, scholars like Leonardo Bruni developed a new understanding of history that distinguished ancient, medieval and modern periods, allowing them to see themselves as recovering the lost wisdom of antiquity. This classical revival appeared most visibly in architecture. Filippo Brunelleschi studied Roman ruins before designing the dome for Florence's cathedral, a technical achievement that had seemed impossible. His other buildings incorporated classical elements like columns, round arches and proportional harmony. Artists like Masaccio developed new techniques for creating realistic human figures and three-dimensional space, inspired by surviving Roman artworks and the rediscovered principles of ancient Greek geometry. Literature, too, reflected this classical turn. Writers began using vernacular Italian rather than Latin for serious works. Dante's Divine Comedy, completed in the early 1300s, drew on classical models while creating something distinctly new. A century later, Petrarch collected and studied ancient manuscripts, establishing the foundations of humanist scholarship with its focus on rhetoric, moral philosophy and history. The early Renaissance represented not a complete break with medieval culture, but a gradual transformation. Churches still dominated the skyline. Religious subjects remained central to artistic production. Guild organizations continued regulating economic life. Yet the balance was shifting toward more secular concerns, greater individual expression, and a new confidence in human capabilities. As night fell across these remarkable cities, their character changed but activity continued. Oil lamps and candles lit workshops where craftsmen continued working into the evening. In Venice, lanterns reflected in the dark waters of the canals as gondolas carried people to social gatherings. In Florence, the night watch patrolled the streets, calling out the hours and watching for fires. In Milan, the massive bulk of the cathedral remained visible against the night sky, its white marble catching moonlight. Each city followed its own path of development, yet together they created a revolution in urban life that would transform European civilization. As Italian city-states flourished in the West, the once mighty Byzantine Empire entered a long period of contraction. The magnificent urban centres that had preserved Roman traditions for centuries began a slow but unmistakable decline. Constantinople, the greatest medieval city in Christendom, still dominated the eastern Mediterranean with its massive walls and golden domes. Yet beneath its impressive appearance, signs of weakening appeared with each passing decade. The story of Byzantine urban decline spans nearly 3 centuries, from the disastrous Fourth Crusade in 1204 to the final Ottoman conquest in 1453. During this period, cities that had maintained Roman traditions for 1,000 years faced unprecedented challenges. Their walls, churches and palaces, once the envy of the medieval world, gradually crumbled or fell into foreign hands. Yet even in decline, these urban centres preserved elements of classical civilization that would eventually help fuel the Renaissance in the West. Constantinople's changing fortunes reveal this decline most dramatically. In the early 12th century, the city still impressed visitors with its grandeur. The German bishop Otto of Freising called it excelling all other cities, while Benjamin of Tudela described bustling markets filled with merchants from every land beneath the sun. The city's population remained around 400,000, making it several times larger than any Western European city of the period. Within its mighty Theodosian walls, Constantinople maintained a sophisticated urban environment that seemed almost magical to Western visitors. Water flowed through ancient aqueducts into hundreds of public fountains and private homes. Wide avenues lined with statues connected grand squares where ordinary citizens mingled with silk-robed officials. The great palace complex stretched along the shore of the Marmara Sea, its gardens and pavilions descending in terraces toward the water. Above everything rose the massive dome of Hagia Sophia, seeming to float on light that streamed through its many windows. This urban splendour rested on increasingly shaky foundations. The Byzantine economy, once the most sophisticated in the Mediterranean, faced mounting difficulties. Military defeats led to the loss of productive agricultural regions in Anatolia. Taxation grew heavier on remaining territories, burdening urban populations. Trade concessions granted to Italian merchants, particularly the Venetians, undermined native Byzantine commerce. By the late 12th century, much of the city's trade was in foreign hands, with Italian merchants occupying entire quarters along the Golden Horn. The catastrophe that accelerated Byzantine urban decline came in 1204, when the armies of the Fourth Crusade, diverted from their supposed goal of liberating Jerusalem, captured Constantinople. For 3 days, Western knights and their followers looted the greatest Christian city in the world. They stripped churches of gold and jewels, melted down bronze statues for coin, and loaded ships with treasures accumulated over 9 centuries. The fire that consumed homes, the blood that flowed in the streets, the holy places defiled by men wearing crosses, wrote the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniets. These things would move even a heart of stone. When the violence ended, a Latin emperor sat on the Byzantine throne, and the conquerors divided the empire among themselves. The physical damage to Constantinople was severe but repairable. More devastating was the psychological blow to Byzantine confidence and the disruption of administrative and economic systems. The city's population plummeted as many residents fled. Great palaces stood empty, or were occupied by Western nobles unfamiliar with their operation and maintenance. Mosaics darkened with smoke from cooking fires lit by soldiers unaccustomed to sophisticated heating systems. The Byzantines eventually recaptured their capital in 1261, but the restored empire was a shadow of its former self. Under the Paleologan dynasty, Constantinople experienced a partial recovery. Emperor Michael VIII repaired some public buildings and restored water systems. A remarkable cultural revival occurred, with artists and scholars preserving ancient knowledge and developing distinctive new styles. Chorachurch, with its magnificent mosaics and frescoes completed around 1320, stands as testimony to this late Byzantine artistic flowering. Yet the city never regained its former population or prosperity. Entire neighbourhoods within the walls returned to agricultural use. Gardens and small farms appeared where apartment buildings and workshops had once stood. Travellers described passing through stretches of open countryside after entering the city gates but before reaching inhabited areas. The Spanish visitor Pero Tafur wrote in the 1430s that much of the city is uninhabited and has been reduced to fields and gardens. Provincial Byzantine cities suffered even more severely than the capital. Thessalonica, the empire's second city, experienced repeated sieges by various enemies. Normans, Bulgarians and Serbs all attacked its walls during this period. Though it remained an important cultural centre with magnificent churches decorated with mosaics and frescoes, its commercial life weakened as trade networks fragmented. In Western Asia Minor, once prosperous cities like Ephesus and Nicaea gradually lost their Byzantine character as Turkish settlement increased. Ephesus, which had maintained much of its ancient Roman street plan into the Middle Byzantine period, shrank dramatically. Its population retreated to a small fortified settlement on the hill of Ayasuluk, abandoning the broad colonnaded streets and grand public buildings of the lower city. The famous Church of St. John, once a magnificent pilgrimage site, fell into disrepair, though pilgrims continued to visit the Apostles' tomb. Nicaea briefly rose to prominence as the capital of a Byzantine successor state after 1204, hosting the imperial court and patriarch who had fled Constantinople. For nearly 60 years, this city maintained Byzantine traditions behind its impressively preserved Roman walls. Scholars, artists, and officials continued their work, and the city even experienced modest prosperity. But after Constantinople's recovery in 1261, Nicaea lost its special status and gradually declined as Turkish pressure increased. By the early 14th century it had fallen to the Ottomans, its churches converted to mosques, its Greek population diminished. Trebizond on the Black Sea coast followed a different path. Protected by mountain ranges and maintaining valuable trade connections with both Turkish territories and lands across the Black Sea, this city preserved its independence as a separate empire until 1461. Behind its strong walls, Byzantine traditions continued longer than anywhere else. Churches were built and decorated in traditional styles, and the ruling Komnenos dynasty maintained court ceremonies inherited from Constantinople. Yet even here, the urban environment contracted, with the population concentrated in a smaller area than in earlier centuries. The physical transformation of Byzantine cities during this period reveals much about changing conditions. Walls received constant attention, with limited resources focused on these essential defences. Churches continued to be built and decorated, though on a smaller scale than before. But civic infrastructure, the streets, water systems, and public buildings that had made Byzantine cities distinctive, received less maintenance. Aqueducts that broke remained unrepaired. Paved streets gradually disappeared under accumulated earth and debris. Public spaces became irregular as buildings encroached on squares and colonnades. Inside these contracting cities, daily life adapted to new limitations. Water, once available from numerous public fountains, became scarcer as aqueduct systems deteriorated. Residents relied more on wells and cisterns. Food grown within city walls supplemented supplies from surrounding countryside, which had become less secure due to political instability. The sound of church bells remained a constant, marking the hours with prayers that provided structure and comfort amid uncertainty. Commercial life continued, but at reduced volume. Local markets served everyday needs, but international trade increasingly passed into foreign hands. In Constantinople, Italian merchants dominated the Golden Horn waterfront with their warehouses and docks. Genoese Galata, across from Constantinople proper, grew into a prosperous foreign enclave, its tall tower symbolizing the shifting balance of commercial power. Despite these difficulties, Byzantine cities maintained remarkable cultural continuity. Scholars continued copying ancient manuscripts and teaching classical knowledge. The walls of newer, smaller churches still glowed with mosaics and frescoes created according to traditions reaching back to early Christian times. Court ceremonies, though performed with less splendour, followed patterns established centuries earlier. This cultural resilience would prove important for the preservation and eventual transmission of classical knowledge to Renaissance Italy. The final phase of Byzantine urban history began in the mid-14th century, as the Ottoman Turks established themselves in Europe and gradually encircled Constantinople. Byzantine cities in Asia Minor had already fallen one by one: Ephesus, Nicaea, Philadelphia. Their Greek populations diminished through emigration, conversion, or displacement. Now European cities came under pressure. Thessalonica changed hands repeatedly during this period, falling to the Ottomans, being sold to Venice, and finally returning to Ottoman control in 1430. Each transition brought physical changes to the urban landscape. Churches became mosques, new bazaars were constructed, and the ethnic composition of the population shifted. Yet beneath these changes, the basic urban structure established during late antiquity remained visible. The grid pattern of streets, the circuit of walls, the central positioning of major religious buildings. Constantinople itself, the last Byzantine stronghold, presented a poignant picture of faded glory in its final years. By 1450, its population had fallen to perhaps 50,000, occupying certain neighbourhoods while others lay abandoned. The Emperor Constantine XVI ruled over what was essentially a city-state, as most provincial territories had been lost to the Ottomans. Diplomatic missions sought Western help, offering church union despite popular opposition. Repairs to the ancient walls consumed what resources remained. When the end came in May 1453, it marked not just the fall of a city, but the conclusion of a civilization. Ottoman cannons breached the Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople for a millennium. Sultan Mehmet II rode through the streets to Hagia Sophia, which was immediately converted to a mosque. Byzantine court officials, scholars, and artists who survived fled westward, many eventually reaching Italy, where their knowledge would contribute to Renaissance learning. The physical legacy of Byzantine urbanism endured even after Ottoman conquest. New rulers adapted Byzantine structures to their own needs rather than destroying them. Hagia Sophia became the model for Ottoman imperial mosques. Byzantine cisterns continued supplying water. The street layout influenced Ottoman Constantinople's development. In provincial centres too, Turkish cities often grew directly upon Byzantine foundations, incorporating existing walls, streets, and public buildings into new urban forms. The broader legacy of Byzantine urban civilization proved equally significant. The preservation of classical knowledge, artistic techniques, and legal concepts in Byzantine cities provided crucial resources for the Renaissance. Urban planning principles developed through Byzantine experience influenced Italian cities. Most fundamentally, the Byzantine urban tradition maintained the ideal of the city as a centre of civilization, learning, and spiritual life through centuries when Western European urbanism had contracted dramatically. As darkness fell across the former Byzantine lands in the late 15th century, the physical form of its cities had changed hands, but the urban patterns established during a millennium of Byzantine rule continued to shape life along the eastern Mediterranean. The domes that had once crowned churches now topped mosques, but beneath them, people still walked streets first laid out by Roman surveyors and gathered in marketplaces that had heard Byzantine Greek for 1,000 years. As Byzantine cities faded in the east, a remarkable transformation was taking shape across Western Europe. In the years between 1350 and 1450, urban life underwent profound changes that would set the stage for the flowering of the Renaissance. These changes began with tragedy but ultimately opened paths to new urban forms and ideas that would reshape how people lived together in cities. The most dramatic event affecting medieval cities was the arrival of the Black Death in 1347. This devastating plague swept through Europe's urban centres with terrifying speed. In just 3 years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in many cities. Florence lost nearly 60,000 people. Paris saw perhaps 50,000 deaths. Smaller towns suffered equally severe losses in proportion to their size. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Giovanni Boccaccio described Florence during the plague. How many great palaces, how many beautiful homes, how many noble dwellings, once filled with families and households, now stood empty to the last servant. Streets that had buzzed with activity fell silent. Markets emptied. Workshops closed as craftsmen died or fled to the countryside seeking safety. Yet this terrible loss of life created unexpected opportunities for survivors. With fewer people competing for the same amount of land and resources, those who lived through the plague often found their economic position improved. Wages rose as the shortage of workers gave common labourers more bargaining power. Rents in crowded urban districts fell as homes stood empty. Cities began recovering within a generation, though in changed form. New residents moved in from rural areas, attracted by higher urban wages and the chance to fill vacant positions in crafts and trades. These newcomers brought different customs and perspectives. Many cities experienced a cultural mixing that would not have happened without the population turnover caused by the plague. Recovery rates varied widely. In northern Italy and Flanders, where trade networks remained strongest, cities rebounded most quickly. Venice and Bruges regained their former populations within 50 years. Other regions recovered more slowly. Some smaller towns never returned to their pre-plague size, remaining permanently diminished. The physical fabric of cities changed significantly during this period. The sudden drop in population allowed for urban reorganization that would have been impossible in more crowded conditions. Streets were widened in many city centres. Open spaces appeared where tightly packed buildings had once stood. For the first time in centuries, there was room to build within the walls of established cities. Wealthy survivors used their increased resources to construct new buildings in the latest styles. Gothic architecture reached its flamboyant phase in Northern Europe, with elaborate tracery and soaring spires adorning new churches and guild halls. In Italy, the first hints of Renaissance design appeared as architects like Brunelleschi studied Roman ruins and applied classical principles to new structures. The Palazzo Medici in Florence, built in the 1440s, represented this new urban architecture. Unlike the tall, narrow tower houses of earlier medieval cities, it spread horizontally along the street, its rusticated stone facade projecting strength and stability. Inside, its courtyard brought light and air into the building's centre, drawing inspiration from ancient Roman homes. Public buildings received particular attention as city governments sought to express civic pride and authority. Town halls grew more elaborate, often featuring tall towers that competed with church steeples for dominance of the urban skyline. In Brussels, the magnificent Gothic town hall rose in the Grand Place, its facade decorated with statues of nobles, saints, and historical figures important to the city's identity. Streets themselves became objects of civic concern. Before the plague, most urban streets had been narrow, winding paths that followed ancient property lines. After the plague, some cities began straightening and widening main thoroughfares. Florence's Via dei Calzaioli was widened to create a more impressive approach to the cathedral square. These improvements made cities more navigable while reducing congestion and fire hazards. Urban sanitation, long neglected, received new attention after the plague experience. Though medieval people didn't understand that diseases like plague were caused by microorganisms, they recognized connections between filth and illness. Many cities appointed health officers charged with ensuring cleaner public spaces. Ordinances required residents to remove garbage from streets. Some towns built or expanded sewage systems to carry waste away from populated areas. Water systems also improved in many cities. Milan renovated its network of canals, allowing for better transportation and drainage. German cities built elaborate fountains in market squares, providing fresh water for residents while demonstrating civic wealth and engineering skill. The sound of flowing water became a constant presence in urban life, marking the difference between prosperous towns and poorer settlements dependent on wells. City walls, along the defining boundary between urban and rural space, changed function during this period. With improved artillery making traditional defences less effective, many cities built new, lower and thicker walls with angled bastions designed to withstand cannon fire. These renovations required enormous investment, but reflected the continuing importance of urban autonomy and self-protection. The governance of cities evolved significantly in the late medieval period. Earlier medieval towns had often enjoyed considerable independence, functioning almost as city-states with their own laws and armies. By the 15th century, most cities found themselves increasingly integrated into larger territorial states led by kings, dukes, or other territorial rulers. In France, royal officials played growing roles in urban governance, sometimes clashing with traditional city councils. English towns negotiated rights and privileges through Parliament while accepting the king's authority. In Germany, the distinction between free imperial cities, answering directly to the emperor, and territorial towns subject to local princes, became increasingly important to urban identity and governance. Despite these external pressures, internal city administration grew more sophisticated. Specialized departments emerged to handle different aspects of urban life. Florence's Office of Abundance managed grain supplies to prevent food shortages. Special magistrates oversaw market regulations, building codes, and public health measures. Cities hired professional administrators with legal training to manage increasingly complex urban affairs. Tax systems became more elaborate as cities faced growing expenses for defense, public works, and debt service. Property registers carefully recorded ownership and value of urban buildings. Custom duties collected at city gates provided revenue from trade flowing through urban markets. Special taxes funded specific projects like wall construction or cathedral building. Record-keeping expanded dramatically. City archives filled with tax records, council minutes, legal judgments, and correspondence. Unlike earlier periods when many agreements were sealed with handshakes and witnessed orally, 15th century urban life generated mountains of paperwork. The rustling of documents and scratching of pens became common sounds in town halls across Europe. Perhaps the most profound change in late medieval cities came through the rediscovery of classical urban ideals. As humanist scholars studied ancient texts, they encountered Roman and Greek ideas about city planning, architecture, and civic life. Vitruvius's ancient treatise on architecture, rediscovered and widely copied in the 15th century, offered specific guidance on street layouts, building proportions, and urban amenities. These classical models inspired new thinking about what cities could be. Rather than accepting the irregular, crowded patterns inherited from early medieval development, urban leaders began considering how to create more beautiful, orderly urban spaces. Alberti's architectural treatises, written in the 1450s, applied classical principles to contemporary urban problems, suggesting that cities should be designed for both utility and beauty. The first practical applications of these ideas appeared in smaller projects rather than wholesale urban redesigns. A new square might be laid out with carefully proportioned buildings on all sides. An important street could be straightened and widened to create a more impressive approach to a cathedral or palace. The radial pattern of streets emanating from central plazas, later a hallmark of Renaissance urban planning, began appearing in limited forms. Painters started depicting cities differently, showing ideal urban landscapes that combined real features with imagined improvements. The concept of urban perspective emerged, with streets and buildings arranged to create harmonious views and vistas. These painted cities often looked more orderly than their real counterparts, but they expressed new aspirations for urban space. Technological developments accelerated urban transformation. The spread of mechanical clocks changed how city dwellers experienced time. Instead of relying on church bells marking irregular hours that varied with the seasons, urban residents began organizing their days around consistent clock time. By 1450, most major European cities had installed public clocks on towers in central locations, their steady ticking providing a new rhythm for urban life. Printing technology, developed by Gutenberg around 1450, would soon transform how knowledge spread through cities. While its greatest impacts lay in the future, the first urban printing shops appeared during this transitional period, beginning this democratization of reading and learning that would reshape city culture. Economic patterns evolved as well. Banking became increasingly sophisticated in commercial centres like Florence, Bruges, and Augsburg. International trading companies established offices in multiple cities, creating networks that exchanged not just goods, but information and cultural influences. New forms of business organisation, like joint stock companies and partnerships, allowed for larger economic ventures than individual merchants could support. These economic changes affected the social structure of cities. The old medieval division between nobles, clergy, and commoners gave way to more complex hierarchies based partly on wealth rather than birth. Successful merchants might live more grandly than minor nobles. Guildmasters formed a solid middle rank between the wealthy elite and ordinary workers. Professionals like lawyers, physicians, and notaries created a new kind of urban elite based on education rather than inherited status. As the 15th century advanced, medieval cities were gradually transforming into something new. They remained tied to their past. Roman streets still guided movement through many town centres. Medieval walls still defined urban boundaries. Ancient parish churches still served local neighbourhoods. Yet within this inherited framework, the foundations of Renaissance urbanism were taking shape. The cities that would host the flowering of Renaissance culture in the decades to come had already begun their transformation from medieval centres to early modern urban environments. Their streets still echoed with the sounds of traditional crafts and trades, the hammering of smiths, the calls of street vendors, the chanting of monks in procession. But new sounds were joining this ancient chorus, the striking of mechanical clocks, the discussions of humanist scholars, the scratch of architects' pens as they designed buildings according to classical proportions. As night falls over the medieval cities we've explored, the enduring presence of Rome remains visible in the shadows. From Constantinople to London, from Cordoba to Paris, the legacy of Roman urban life persists through 1,000 years of change. Like a great stone foundation beneath newer buildings, the Roman pattern upholds and shapes the medieval world above it. Though transformed by time, faith, and new peoples, the Roman city never truly disappeared from Europe. The most visible links to the Roman past were the physical remains that dotted the medieval landscape. City walls, built by Roman engineers to protect provincial towns, continued to serve medieval communities. In London, Roman walls enclosed the medieval city until it eventually outgrew them in the 12th century. Tours, Nîmes, and countless other towns relied on these ancient defences, sometimes heightening or strengthening them, but following the original Roman circuit. These massive structures, with their carefully fitted stones and regularly spaced towers, reminded medieval citizens daily of the engineering prowess of their predecessors. Roman streets guided medieval feet along paths first laid out centuries earlier. Though often narrowed as buildings encroached on the original wide avenues, the basic grid pattern of many Roman foundations remained visible beneath medieval adaptations. In cities like Florence and Bologna, main streets followed the lines of the ancient Roman Cardo and Decumanus. These thoroughfares, sometimes repaved or resurfaced but rarely rerouted, connected the same key points of the city that they had in Roman times. Roman monuments stood as landmarks, repurposed but unforgotten. In Nîmes, the magnificent arena became a fortified neighbourhood housing hundreds of people. In Rome, the ancient theatre of Marcellus was transformed into a fortress for the Orsini family. The Pantheon survived as the church of Santa Maria Rotonda, its perfect dome still inspiring awe. These ancient structures shaped the medieval urban experience, providing both practical resources and visible links to the past. The sensory experience of these physical remains added depth to medieval urban life. The cool touch of ancient marble columns reused in medieval churches, the echo of footsteps on worn Roman paving stones, the play of light through the windows of a Roman bath converted into a church or palace, the solid feeling of Roman concrete still standing firm after a millennium. Through these tangible connections, medieval people experienced their Roman heritage with all their senses. Less visible but equally important was the administrative and legal inheritance from Rome. Though adapted to new conditions, many Roman concepts of governance and law persisted through the medieval period. Municipal councils and Italian communes traced their ancestry to Roman city councils. The very concept of civic governance, that a city should manage its own affairs through representatives, descended directly from Roman practice. Roman legal traditions proved especially durable. In southern France and Italy, aspects of Roman civil law continued without interruption, forming the basis for local regulations. When legal study revived at Bologna in the 11th century, scholars focused intensely on Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the great compilation of Roman law. These legal principles, though modified by medieval customs and needs, provided frameworks for contracts, property rights, and dispute resolution throughout medieval Europe. Even the terminology of urban administration preserved Roman echoes. The mayor of a medieval town derived from the Latin mea, while terms for city officials like provost evolved from Roman titles. Tax assessment methods, property boundaries, and market regulations often followed patterns established during the Roman period, with adaptations for medieval economic and social structures. Many practical aspects of urban management showed remarkable continuity. Water systems in cities from Cologne to Cordoba often incorporated Roman aqueducts, pipes, or channels, sometimes with medieval repairs or extensions. Street maintenance responsibilities, waste disposal regulations, and fire prevention measures frequently built upon Roman precedents. The cultural memory of Rome proved powerful even where physical and administrative continuities were weaker. Cities proudly traced their origins to Roman foundations, often embellishing their histories with legendary connections. Chronicles of medieval towns typically began with accounts, sometimes fanciful, of their Roman founders. These origin stories strengthened civic identity and provided citizens with a sense of connection to an illustrious past. Civic rituals and ceremonies in medieval cities sometimes preserved or reinvented Roman practices. Processions followed ancient routes. City seals and coins displayed Roman imagery or Latin mottos. Public spaces that had been forums in Roman times remained gathering places for civic events, though now dominated by cathedrals or town halls rather than temples. The very concept of citizenship, belonging to an urban community with special rights and responsibilities, survived from Roman times. Though medieval citizenship differed in many ways from its Roman counterpart, the basic notion that city dwellers formed a distinct community with shared privileges and obligations maintained the Roman tradition of the city as a unique social and political entity. These various forms of continuity did not mean that medieval cities were simply diminished versions of Roman ones. Instead, they represented a creative synthesis, a bridge between ancient and modern urban concepts. Medieval cities preserved elements of the Roman past while adding innovations that would shape the future. The medieval emphasis on the city as a religious centre, organised around cathedrals and parish churches, transformed the urban landscape that Rome had created. This Christian reconfiguration of space established patterns that would influence European cities for centuries to come. The placement of churches at key points throughout the city created new focal points for neighbourhoods and communities. The guild system that organised medieval urban production and governance had no direct Roman equivalent, yet it emerged within the physical framework that Rome had established. Craft specialisation by street or quarter often followed ancient patterns while adapting them to new economic realities. Guild halls became important urban buildings, housing organisations that regulated quality standards, training and market practices. The medieval legal concept of urban liberties, specific rights granted to cities through charters, built upon Roman municipal traditions while developing them in new directions. The famous saying, "City air makes you free," captured the medieval innovation that towns could serve as islands of personal freedom within the feudal landscape, offering liberation from serfdom to those who lived within their walls for a year and a day. These medieval developments did not represent a complete break with Roman patterns, but rather an evolution. The medieval city served as a crucial link between ancient urban concepts and modern ones, preserving some elements of Roman urbanism while transforming others to meet new needs and conditions. As the medieval period drew to a close in the 14th and 15th centuries, this evolutionary process continued. The early Renaissance in Italy consciously looked back to Roman models while developing new approaches to urban design and architecture. The medieval city, having preserved and adapted the Roman legacy through centuries of change, now provided the foundation for new innovations inspired by classical ideals. Throughout these many centuries of transformation, one aspect of urban life showed remarkable continuity: the human experience of living together in communities. Whether in a flourishing Byzantine provincial capital, a contracted northern European town, or a bustling Italian commune, medieval city dwellers faced challenges familiar to their Roman predecessors and to us today. They sought security behind protective walls. They gathered in marketplaces to trade goods and exchange news. They celebrated festivals that mark the rhythm of the year. They took pride in distinctive local traditions and competed with neighbouring cities. They dealt with crowding, sanitation problems, fire hazards, and the difficulties of governing diverse populations with competing interests. The story of Roman cities in medieval times is ultimately a human story, a testament to continuity and adaptation, to preservation and innovation. The medieval inhabitants of these transformed Roman spaces were not conscious archaeologists trying to preserve the past, nor were they revolutionaries seeking to erase it. They were practical people making use of the resources at hand, including the physical, legal, and cultural inheritance from Rome. As darkness falls across these cities that bridged ancient and medieval worlds, we can imagine the quiet streets where Roman pavement stones still guided evening travellers. The towering walls built by long-dead legionaries still sheltered sleeping citizens. Medieval bells rang from church towers standing where Roman temples once stood. And in homes throughout these cities, some built directly on Roman foundations, people dreamed beneath the same stars that had watched over their Roman predecessors. The story of these cities reminds us that human settlements, like human societies themselves, are never completely replaced but rather continually transformed. Each generation builds upon what came before, adapting old structures to new needs, preserving what remains useful, and gradually creating new forms that future generations will inherit and transform in their turn. In this endless process of change and continuity, the legacy of Roman cities remains embedded in the landscape of Europe, in street patterns and building foundations, in legal concepts and administrative practices, and in the very idea of the city as the centre of civilization.